Okay, we have a quorum, so we'll start. So did I understand correctly that Chantal's going to be late, so you'll do the honors?
That's correct. Let's see. Well, actually, we'll give Philip a
Go ahead, Philip.
try here.
We'll have you
Sorry,
call the roll.
Yeah, I don't
Here,
even have.
read off the agenda.
Thank you. Okay. So we'll be doing the roll call.
Yes.
And we have ex-cab member Gregory Broyle. Phil Burton.
Here.
Tony Carrasco.
Here.
Ing Young Chow. Megan. Okay. No, she's not here. So that's Pat. Sorry.
No, it's not here.
Megan Kahn.
Here.
Larry Klein. Pat Lau.
Here.
Adina Levin. Nadia Naik.
Here.
Keith Reckdahl.
Nope.
David Shen.
Nope.
Carrie Templeton.
Nope.
Do we have a quorum?
We do, we have 7.
We do, oh.
Yeah.
And
And I
we
know
have a quorum.
Dave Shen is going to be late. He had already let us know. I'm not sure about everybody else. Okay, so the first item on the agenda is oral communications. This is for members of the public who wish to speak on an item that is not on the agenda. Could I get a show of hands of how many folks would like to speak on something not agendized? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Any item not on the agenda, if you want to do public comment. Sorry, can I get those hands raised high so I can count my time? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, I will do 2 minutes each. If you could line up one by one so that we'd save time of everybody kind of changing positions, that would be great. Since Chantal is not here, I will try using my terrible timer, but I will warn you now, it's loud. So my apologies. Okay, go for it. Turn your mic on.
Good afternoon, evening. I just tried to do a little bit of digging for my advocacy, and I went through some older things that I noticed. Safety was I'm advocating for safety being the highest priority for Churchill. I know you bring up a lot of other things, connectivity and arterials and all kinds of stuff, but if you go back to the Connecting Palo Alto 2017 program that were, I think, over 100 people, as we broke it down by, we voted on our phones, safety was the #1 issue that came up for Churchill, not any of the other ones, not any of the other grade separations, but Churchill safety was the #1. And I also looked through the bicycle and transportation plan, and they have a whole policy about continue to prioritize safety and comfort of school children in street modification projects that affect school travel routes, and that's one of the goals of the bicycle and pedestrian transportation plan. Also, there are 1,000 bikes and pedestrians basically crossing Churchill every day. I think that you're not really giving them the priority that they should have, and for me, that's the major priority. Let's see, and then I'd like to also add, and when you get the collision data, it's already in some other places that it shows that Churchill and Alma is very problematic, and it's not the highest, but I think it's one of the second highest in the city in terms of collisions. Then I think you also need to really concentrate on improving the flow on major arterials. The 2 arterials that intersect are Embarcadero and Alma. The reason there's such a problem there is because any traffic engineer would tell you there are 2 traffic turns that are not possible at where those 2 major streets intersect.
Thank you,
Alma
Carrie.
southbound to Embarcadero West to Alma South.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
so I think if you close Churchill and with mitigations, those problems will be solved.
Thank you. And as a reminder, everyone can always also email us comments. I just want to make sure everyone remembers that. I just want to recognize that In Young and Carrie have also arrived. Next, thank you.
Hi, my name is Eileen Fagan. I live in Southgate, and I'm also here to talk about Churchill, and I think that right now, the 2 major things on the table are closing Churchill and viaducts, and honestly, most of the people in Southgate that I've talked to, and definitely myself, think that both of those are horrible options. The viaduct is going to make our beautiful tree-lined city look like an industrial city, so that is a non-starter and awful. I think a lot of people will just leave Palo Alto because it won't be the same city that it is. Closing Churchill is a complete overreaction to what needs to happen, and there are much better options being discussed for every other intersection. And thank God and thank Mike Price for coming up with a third option. And so I would very much like to advocate that this group spend not just some of their energy, but all of their energy on making that the option and moving forward to figure out how that is the most workable. I agree, by the way, on safety, and I want to make a note of that. I live on Castellea, which is the other major bike artery. And one of the things that people have talked about when you start to talk about closing Churchill is there have to be a million other ways to move people around. And I call Castellea the Pali Freeway in the morning and the afternoon. I just came through there. Hundreds and hundreds of bikes come through there. Those streets are narrow. And if you even consider opening up Castellea and Park to mitigate Churchill, children will die. I'm just going to say that flat out because it is already so tight. People have trouble getting out of their driveways, getting down that street, and it should be given over to the kids. And let's make sure that that's what happens. So my advocacy, let's put our energy into idea number 3, and let's make sure that that's the one that's chosen.
Thank you. Next.
Hello, I'm Kathleen Goldfein. I live on Alma Street, and I'm very concerned about Caltrain's desire to add an additional 2 tracks between Mountain View and California Avenue. They haven't talked about it much, but I went to the last Caltrain meeting, and I said, is that off the plate? Because they're not talking about it very much. And they said, well, we picked the moderate plan for 2040, which doesn't include that. However, we have reserved the right to add those 2 tracks. And I'm not quite sure how we can even come up with a plan for Meadow and Charleston unless that's settled. And if you have to have 4 tracks that you go under instead of 2, it's an entirely different proposition. I hope you're all keeping this in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Next. And if you guys could line up if you intend to speak, that would be great.
I had a longer thank you for you guys, but in the interest of time, thank you. There are many things I could say about the choices before you, but I want to speak for many in my neighborhood of Southgate and simply urge you to eliminate closing Churchill from the set of options. In spite of Hexagon's recent efforts, we are not persuaded that the traffic consequences of Churchill closure can be adequately mitigated. Indeed, Gary himself admits that worsening conditions at El Camino in Oregon cannot be mitigated in the face of the diversion of cars from Churchill, and that is based on traffic projections only 10 years out. Neighborhoods near Embarcadero have compelling arguments that effects on their streets have not been adequately understood. Gary has said that they will dig into it if Churchill closure is approved, meaning that you would be making this decision without any confidence about the ultimate shape of changes to our streets. And without traffic projections in alignment with regional estimates, it would be almost irresponsible to approve closure at one of our few east-west corridors. From a neighborhood perspective, many of us in Southgate feel that closing Churchill would be damaging not only to our property values, but to our quality of life, our connection to the rest of the city, and the composition of the neighborhood in the long run. I'll provide copies of a document by Southgate neighbors expressing these concerns, but we'll spell it out a little here. Since we are west of the tracks, and many of Palo Alto's neighborhoods and amenities are east of the tracks, our access to and ease of movement through the city would be seriously compromised. We would be isolated with only one way out of the neighborhood onto El Camino. God forbid Piers Park should open, and the travel time required to engage in ordinary enjoyment of our city would increase significantly. Some of us have already done some experiments. Woo! Anyway, it increases 3 times.
Thank you, Sue.
About. Don't close it, please.
Anybody else who wanted to speak on this topic? I saw some hands before.
Yeah, my name is Lucy Lapierre, and I'm Southgate adjacent. I live on the other side of Alma, and I commuted by bicycle to Stanford for many years, up Churchill and down Churchill every single day. My kids all went to Pali, and I would strongly recommend that this committee look more broadly at the issue and not close Churchill. I think that's a complete overreaction, and it's based on the recommendation of a handful of neighbors in Southgate. And I'm always mystified how the city listens to just a few people's opinion and runs forward with that. And I think when you think about what the superintendent wrote today, 1,000 kids a day cross Alma to get to Pali, plus staff, plus people who work and study at Stanford. Closing Churchill is a complete overreaction and a waste of money, which will be borne by people like us who actually pay taxes and not by the people who are Prop 13 beneficiaries and seem to want to close off every neighborhood to cars and development and airplane noise, but meanwhile have more pickleball courts, none of which they want to pay for. So I would say, please, leave Churchill open. You could do a lot with Embarcadero Road. If anyone goes on that at rush hour, you can see the traffic signals are completely not in alignment, and it backs up, and closing Churchill is going to make that much worse. So try focusing on aligning the signals on Embarcadero and making traffic run smoothly, and people will adjust who need to drive down Churchill when there are more trains. They will find other routes. Save our money, save our taxpayers' money, and don't close Churchill.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Chacon. I live at the corner of High Street in Embarcadero. 2 points. One of them is that I did some research with the chief planning official of Palo Alto regarding the historic nature of the Embarcadero Underpass Alma Bridge, and it is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. It was discussed in the EIR for the electrification of Caltrain's project, and you guys should consider that with whatever you decide to do, because it's not necessarily a slam dunk to say it's not historic, we can take it down and rebuild it. So you should do some more homework on that and understand what the implications are if you indeed decide closing Churchill and routing 7,000 cars to Embarcadero, because that bridge may not be able to be demolished. Second thing is I just want to say thank you to the city and to XCAP for all your work, and for the town hall meeting. Really appreciate that. And to thank the town hall meeting, of course, is to inform the residents of the options. And I want to thank Ed specifically for allowing us to participate in providing that information. So thank you.
Okay, next.
So I'll reiterate what Michael just said, and since then we've received a lot of feedback about this option at Churchill, and would like to talk to someone about how that feedback could be incorporated into the evaluation of the intersection, because it will probably address some of the issues that may come up during the AECOM's look. So if we can figure out some way that issues raised by AECOM can be addressed by the group that's working on this proposal and feedback, some of the community feedback, that might be a way of moving this thing along more quickly.
Thank you. Anybody else for an item not on the agenda who would like to speak? Okay. I did want to just, to the person who talked to us about the second set of tracks between Cal Ave and San Antonio, we hear you. It's very useful, if you've not seen it, to watch the Sebastian Petty of Caltrain came to speak to us about the 4 tracks in South Palo Alto, and that was brought up in that meeting. So if you're interested in that topic, I would encourage you to make sure to go on the Connecting Palo Alto website and listen to that meeting, so you can hear firsthand the question and answers between this committee and Caltrain related to that issue. So I wanted to make sure that we cover that. Which date was that? I don't recall, because I feel like we have a meeting every week at this point, and I've lost track. But I think it was, yeah, we can get it in a second. It was 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think it might have been January 22nd, or 29th, one of those two, I believe. Ed, do we have any special timing on the next round of feedback, sort of the AECOM new ideas, Mike Price is concerned.
No, we're still working with them on that.
Mike, maybe we could follow up via email offline, and you can send us whatever you've got, and then we can figure out what the next step would be on that.
According to my notes.
January 29th.
Yes,
Perfect.
January 29th,
you.
Sebastian Petty.
There you go. Awesome. Thank you, ex-cappers. Okay. All right, the next item on our thing is a discussion. It's an update related to the measurable criteria, and I think this is where you guys are up.
Yeah, thank you. And also similarly, no update. We're still working on it.
Okay. Do we have a ETA?
Sorry.
I said, do we have an ETA when we might, when the next, this is the ongoing list of ex-cap questions and then stuff related to any measurable criteria that's already calculated in the normal course of business. Do we have anything on those?
Yeah, I don't think we can provide a timeline at this point, but we're working
Okay.
on it.
Okay. Okay, I, obviously, as we start deliberations, we're going to need that. So we'll have to talk offline about what's the best way to get that going forward, but it's going to be really difficult to move on that if we aren't getting those, so, but we can talk more about it. Okay, do we have anyone who has public comment on item number 3, which is the non-existent update related to measurable criteria? Okay, seeing none, we will move straight to the meaty part of the conversation. So the next one is an action item, which is drafted as ex-cap evaluation of existing alternatives, process by which to review alternatives, and draft outline report, which is a mouthful. So the intent of this item is to briefly discuss the proposed outline. So at the last meeting, we talked about a table of contents and what that might look like. And so you should have picked up from over there an outline of a table of contents. And in the back, which is the part that I would like feedback from ex-cappers on, has various sections. We are responsible for writing this report, and so to the extent possible, as much pre-writing as we can do while we're still doing our deliberating on things that are sort of introductory topics, if you will, or just sort of explaining to the average person what this process has been. We're hoping to get help from ex-cap members to write those, so I want you to very carefully, at the beginning, at the top, you have the list of the working groups that we created at the beginning. And then after that, you have a list of responsibilities going forward in terms of the different proposed ideas for a table of contents. And so I'll let you guys take, I know you just got this at places, I apologize for that. So I want to give you guys a moment to kind of read through and find your name and understand yay or nay if that would work for you. And understanding that we are still missing a few members. I know Keith texted me that he's on his way. And I know that Dave is also will be coming shortly, so hopefully we could at least hear from them, and I will make it a point to reach out to anyone else who didn't make it to today's meeting. If anybody has ex-cappers, if anybody wants to chime in here, or if where you see your name looks okay, a yay or nay would be good, I'll need a confirmation. And the idea would be that you could take a stab at writing that section, and then we would turn those into, you have myself and Larry who will be trying to do the editing of those sections. So on the timeline, actually, I don't see that. On this timeline, which is the milestones, it looks like this. I apologize. I realize it's not numbered correctly. So for those of you in the audience, it's the list of our previous agendas and our going forward agendas. I have agendized on there that we would have an if you're writing a section that you would be able to turn around those sections potentially by March 25th to the group, and that would give us time to start editing those. Of course, if anyone is done sooner, they could turn in their homework earlier. So that was sort of the intent of these. Yes.
How many pages or what kind of a narrative do you anticipate? So one alternative is just, this is the conclusion, this is the final result of, let's say, the increased number of trains per Caltrain business. plan. The other is the chronology, when Caltrain started working on their business plan, what were some of the deliberations, and what were their processes leading up to the decision? Do we want to do the
I
short
think-
version or the document everything version?
So the way I have the proposed table of contents, and this is all up for discussion, so just because I wrote it doesn't mean we can't all edit it, so I just want to make that very clear. But it's just basically a description of the plan that we are dealing with, which is causing us to have to think about grade separations. And so I don't think the chronology is, I mean, the most chronology we might have is that when we started, we looked at 6, and now we're up to 8. But I think, and I think, Phil, if this section is acceptable to you and Adina, you guys could work together on deciding what's appropriate. It's enough to make it so that the average person who picks up this report understands what's going on, but doesn't have to be the long, super dense version.
Well, quoting Mies van der Rohe, more is less, less is more.
Okay.
So that, I would anticipate about a page is what people are willing to read and digest. About a page, maybe 2 pages, not more than that.
I think I would encourage you to write what you think is appropriate. If it's too long, I'm sure the editors will pitch in, and that's me and Larry at that point. And frankly, if it's not enough, we'll also let you know, because I'm sure there's some sections that are so big, it's like, well, really, what can I be writing about? And I'm happy to work offline with anybody who has questions about whatever their section is that they chime in on.
Phil, I'm very fond of the statement that's attributable to Winston Churchill, which he may or may not have said, but the sentiment is absolutely right. I wish I had more time, I would have written less.
I think that was Mark Twain who said that.
A lot of people take credit for it.
I could have written yeah, but I think Mark Twain, well, again, this is all, could be quite apocryphal.
But, no, I think we have a lot of ground to cover, and this is, I think, if we do a perfect job, this will be a document that's persuasive to the public.
Okay.
Even if they don't necessarily agree with all of our conclusions and recommendations, they'll be able to find the reasoning, how we got there, without overburdening them. So I think it's going to be a difficult report to write, and so that I think the idea that we're starting on it now makes perfect sense.
I think it makes perfect sense to get started, the sooner the better, because the process of writing will itself expose issues and gaps in information.
Correct.
The sooner we get on that process, the better, because April 1st is not that far off.
Could you clarify what additional criteria XCAP debated during the process means?
So that would be as we're going through this, if new criteria that isn't exactly specifically on there, but we all determined was important, it was like, as an example, let's see, what's a good example? We've discussed the fact that when bikes have to wait at a traffic signal, it causes them to become a lump, and then they have to, the size of the bike tunnel then has to be thought of in terms of that versus when it's a constant thing. And so if we were as a group to decide like, oh, something to consider about that is this is something that we weighed, and so it's sort of a new criteria or some sort of new understanding that if we could sort of, if you could help synthesize those kinds of things that came forth. And any other questions about the criteria that we've gone through that hasn't, that you feel hasn't really been fleshed out, that we ended up having to sort of self-define?
Okay,
Whatever those are, if that makes sense. Yep.
Just add to what you said, I think there's I don't want to use the word lack of priority for bikes and peds and handicap, but I think that aspect of it, how it's placed, has to be amplified, has to get a higher priority than it does now. And I think many of the speakers have mentioned that. It's not just the origin and the destination, as traffic people like to look at, but it's also the journey and how does that journey feel. Those criteria, I think, should be added on.
Great. Pat and Carrie and Greg, do you guys want to chime in? And In Young?
Yes, actually, I've started, after working as a consultant for Project Safety Net, and tracking information data, if you will, from 2009 and then again in 2014-15, and then looking at current injuries and fatalities on the corridor. I've actually driven also along the corridor all the way from Palo, well, actually, Mountain View all the way to Burlingame, taken a look at the safety measures. I've also taken a look at some of the items that are now on the Caltrain website as far as safety and suicide prevention. And there was an article also about why agencies can't do more to stop the deaths. So again, collecting information, hard data, for collisions as well, including individuals as well as cars, and then trying to understand where we are now. So I have already started on my report, and I'm sharing that information with Egan and Greg, because they're on the committee too, and Greg did a report, collected a report from
The FRA.
FRA, okay, Federal Railroad Administration, on collisions, and there was data on the various crossings.
I actually do have a question about this section. I'm looking forward to working on this section. It's under mitigations, and the title is Future Safety Considerations.
Yeah, that
So
might be
it's-
poorly
it's-
placed.
It's not clear what, so for instance, we could write about, these are the safety risks associated with not separating any of the grades. That's something that I think all three of us are prepared to work on any time. But when you say mitigations, I think should also be addressing, are there additional safety measures we could take in Palo Alto to reduce the risk of injury, even if there were no grade separations at all, just so that people have that information? We don't have quad gates, for instance. So, and I know you have a lot of background on that. So I don't know if you were hoping we would get into that as well. Again, it has to be fairly short.
Yeah, I think, this is where I'd make full use of an appendix, so you could have, Larry and I discussed that the best thing would be someone could pick up this report, read it cover to cover, and hopefully never have to look at the appendix, but still get the gist of it, and then if they were really interested in something, they could go digging. And I think, I don't remember, Pat, if you were here for the meeting where we discussed that in some ways a lot of the safety things that you've raised are things that we're not going to know at this level of engineering, but we don't want to lose that thread. And so I have it under mitigations, future safety considerations, because there may be things that we don't have an answer to now, like will there be a fence at this or that, but that things that we definitely would like to include. And I think, Greg, to your point of what about things that we can do in the interim that might be worth pursuing, and we can certainly, you can come forth with sort of, what I envision will happen is you'll turn something in, Larry and I will attempt to edit something, and then we'll turn it back to you guys and see where everybody is on it. But, if, again, trying to keep it brief, but still being really specific about if there's interim mitigations that we should think about, if it's going to take us 30 years to build things, we might want to think about, is there interim wins, and what might those be?
So there might be three sections, one on background, one on interim mitigations, and the other might be things to consider. Whatever solution the council elects, it is critically important that the following things be taken into consideration.
Yeah, and I think this sort of general outline came from some of the thoughts that Councilmember Cormack had talked about, and when she discussed mitigations, it was sort of mitigations for known issues related to the choices, and so take that as you will in terms of explaining what you'd want.
I have a technical question as well. When you say, Larry and I will edit it and share it with all of you, I imagine we can't all create a Google Doc with everyone in the XCAP on it, because then it would be a public meeting?
So this was a question that Molly was supposed to get back to us on. Did we get?
I think for the time being, no, we don't have a specific recommendation as to how that should be handled. I think for the time being, you can submit it to us, and we will compile and share on an ongoing basis.
So we'll have to then in the meeting discuss our proposed changes.
Well,
and
not necessarily, but let's
Okay.
just start, because,
Okay.
again, we're at the beginning of a process here that we're happy to be the clearinghouse for that.
So would it be,
So hold on, just to be clear, I think it's fine that each of them passes something into Larry and I, but then when we're going to go then distribute to the full group, that's when it goes to you.
Well, I would presume that there's no reluctance to share your drafts at these meetings. So as long as we're meeting weekly, we can always provide a weekly kind of readout on where the draft stands.
Okay.
is there, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Phil.
Is there a requirement that we use Google Docs, or if I'm working with Adina, just Adina on this, and I suspect it'll be mostly me, and I'm more comfortable with Word than Google Docs, and it's pretty much just me. Can't I just use it and send it to Ed? I mean, you can take the Word document.
Yeah, there's.
Adina is quite prolific, though. I suspect you
Yeah.
have no problem
And
with
she-
generating documents.
Yeah, and so, no, there's no technology requirement, just to be clear.
Okay.
You know, you'll do what you can, and to the extent that you're working as a pair, I would encourage you to certainly coordinate.
Oh, I intend to.
I think part of the reason why I asked Adina to participate in this section is frankly, she runs the Friends of Caltrain, Green Caltrain blog, and has already written for other purposes many introductions to what is Caltrain, what is electrification. So there's probably a lot of recycled material.
And maybe she can cut and paste the whole thing.
Exactly, and then you might want to sprinkle in your
just-
Philness, but you may
No.
end up having.
I should resemble that remark, and people know what I mean by that allusion, I hope.
I wanted to chime in about the safety stuff from, I think if your goal is for someone in the future to read it and understand, we may want to have like a community context paragraph in section 1. I know we focused a lot on council and legal requirements, training requirements, but we don't really have that element in there. So community context may be the last little bit, and then that could refer to the reports in the appendix as well. I mean, I'm not talking about a lot of extra work, but just.
What do you mean, can you describe your community context a little bit more? What do you?
The concern around safety for youth and other individuals, suicide prevention, and the activism that's been happening there that has had significant impact and color on this conversation.
Okay. That might be covered under previous actions taken by the council, so I guess we'll have to see, because they've made it as a result of all those things have
As long
called
as,
it out.
as long as it's included, that's fine. I think section 1, wherever you want to put it, if you want to
Yep.
include it there or however. But I just want to make sure that that context I think it would be useful. And as far as the assignment, for me, it looks fine.
Okay, great. In Young, I know I think I put you and Dave together, so I don't know if you want to talk to Dave so far.
So that's existing, all the analysis, put them together, or is there any other new requirements?
Yeah, so basically what, it's really, so summarizing what the process has been. So really just describing, we had town halls, we had meetings, and then you'll see here, I have staff here, if they could collect, if they could link to the website, if they could tell us all the fact sheets, but you and Dave to just put together in prose a description of what XCAP has been, and kind of just telling the story of who we are.
Okay, so
and
it's
what we've
not,
done.
does it have to be chronological, like?
I'll let you guys
Okay.
decide what makes sense. If that, just at a high level explaining that we have a website, we became an official group, we set our own agendas, and this is how we decided to break up the work. It's sort of that.
Okay, we'll.
Okay, great.
I sort of had 3 questions.
Sure.
The first one was information like what we got from the superintendent of schools at this meeting. Where does that sort of context fit in? That's one question, and maybe it is in and Dave's section that they sort of mentioned we had feedback from these people, we had feedback from comments from Caltrain and so forth, but I'm not sure where that would go, or if it would just go directly into the recommendation section.
So what does the group think about, so we have section 2 is methods to understand alternatives. So we have the analysis, the presentations from AECOM, town hall meetings, community meetings, and then maybe we can have a other, which might include certainly PAUSD's feedback, any, I don't know, if we get something from the business community, maybe that. If Stanford happens to chime in, maybe that. I guess big other stakeholders, other big
Sure, well,
stakeholders?
I mean, so was the idea that in this, like, 2.1, we would discuss, like, we had a discussion with a property impacts lawyer, we had a discussion with Caltrain.
Yes, that is what In Young and
Okay.
Dave would sort of describe.
Right.
But then I think maybe we should have a 2.5, it looks like, and that might be other input, I don't know, we can wordsmith it, but other input from stakeholders, and that could be a placeholder for the letter we just got from PAUSD and
The emergency services.
the emergency services, yep.
What about business? I'm sorry. What about business?
That is a good question. So we have been, I know that Chantal was going to try to work on getting feedback from the business community. I don't know that we've had any official feedback from the business community, so.
We have an editorial on the,
We do, yeah, I read it.
yeah, Judy
From
Kleinberg's
Judy.
editorial.
But that's more about the business tax. It's not
business
specifically about
Business tax.
separations and what we're working on. So I want to be really careful to draw a line
sure.
between opinion pieces about how to fund
Right.
grade separations versus the need and the actual separation itself. And so to the extent that I would just encourage, this as an open call for all of you who watch these meetings weekly, and just anybody in the neighborhoods, we have not had folks from the business community other than Judy talk to us about their needs, their wants, their desires, their concerns. And so to the extent that we all have contacts in this community, it would be really good to hear from those folks. And I would encourage you, I know in the past when folks on XCAP have gone to speak to different neighborhoods, we end up getting a lot of neighbors from that neighborhood now coming to XCAP meetings and giving us their thoughts. Anybody who's in a professional association, anybody who talks to businesses, as much as we can to get those folks activated, because for example, I'm going to be doing a presentation to the Barron Park Neighborhood Association. They have a board of, I think it must have been like 8 or 10 people in the room. Only 2 of them had ever really heard about had been to town hall meetings or really even knew what the grade separations was about. And that was very telling, because if I think of the Southgate and Professorville and how engaged those neighborhoods have been, and thinking about like, who are we missing in all the other neighborhoods that are not immediately adjacent to the rail line. So please, I know it's not exactly the most scintillating coffee and, party conversation, but try to weave it in. So I'm not the only one. I would appreciate that.
Nadia, can I, I'm looking at this outline. Could I suggest a restructuring?
Sure.
Okay, so 2.1 and 2.3 are really mostly internal to the XCAP. And then the fact sheets, the website, town hall, community meetings, those are communication to the public and opportunities for soliciting feedback. Could we possibly restructure it into 2 major sections like that? Just to focus a little better. Do you want me to repeat it or rephrase it?
Yeah, can you say it one more time? Because I
Okay,
don't think I was
so
looking at the numbers fast enough.
If we look at 2.1 and 2.2, those are primarily focused on the XCAP. That is, what we learned from AECom, what we did with the information from AECom and other sources to come up with our recommendations. In addition, we have done outreach as a way of educating the public and as a way of soliciting feedback. And those, to me, are somewhat distinct. And if we break them up.
So I think actually in section 2 was intended just to sort of be more of a list of what we've done. I think the actual deliberating part happens in section 4, which is recommendations and rationale. So that's the part that will capture, and frankly, that's the hardest section to write, which I'm the most nervous about, because that is the XCAP process. The rest of it is simply, these are the analysis that's been done by professionals are the fact sheets. We put together a website. We had town hall meetings. So the stuff that you're talking about is really goes into section 4. Does that make sense? So if I'm someone who's never heard about rail and I pick up this report, the first thing I'm going to read is, why do we need grade separations? What is a grade separation? I'm going to read about the number of trains per hour. I'm going to read about how the council told us we had to do it. I'm going to read about the comp plan. I'm going to read maybe about some suicide prevention and things in the community that set the context for people reading this 50 years from now, right? Then my next section is, okay, so we set up this process, which David and Young will write about, and they'll explain, well, we had, started maybe in a certain year, and then we expanded, and then we had a cap, and then we had an X cap, and then we put together fact sheets and a website. And then we had presentations and town hall meetings. And then we have this council criteria, and we go into what was the criteria. And then in section 4, we would say, okay, and then this is what we did. And this is how we got to what we got to and why we made the following recommendations.
It's probably just stylistic. Maybe it's just my style. Okay.
Okay.
That's fine.
Can I suggest a change, though?
Yeah.
In section 1, I think you also have to address high-speed rail.
Yes.
Because to the average person on the street, I don't understand why you're talking about this. High-speed
for
rail's
sure,
never
yeah.
going to happen.
Yes,
But it might.
That's a more true statement than what I said, but that's not what most people think.
I am confident that Adina and Phil will cover that for sure. But if not, you heard it here first. You should make sure that high-speed rail is included in section 1. Yes, I would agree.
Especially with the issue on the passing tracks.
Yeah, so what about, like, petitions from the community or the emails and opinions and is that important
I
for
think,
somewhat, or not, what people think, or, but, I mean, there are many different, a lot of different ones, but you know, we can
So-
categorize each option under.
I think we have to think about the fact that we want to include as much as is needed to tell the story. We're also not going to include, 8,000 pages of signatures and petitions in it because I don't think it's useful. I think a description of what the process has been and how involved the different neighborhoods have been and how that has changed over time would be helpful. I don't know how helpful it is to put in every petition and every subsequent website and every additional other thing that goes in there. I think it's something when we talk about recommendations and rationale and that sort of stuff, it may end up coming into the conversation, right? But I don't know that it necessarily, we've got to put in all the petitions and whatnot. Also because we are charged with making a recommendation to the council, and though we need to show that, that we've heard the community, I think putting in more and more, well, one group had this opinion and one group had a different opinion, only muddies the water further. I think the council is already receiving all of those same petitions and stuff, so it's really just about this is what our group worked on and what we focused on. Does that sound amenable to everybody? Is everyone okay with that? Or do you feel passionately that?
No, I think it's fine because, people who are more vocal is particular concern, and then some people who might have a concern but doesn't have a voice. So, I think it's fair in that regard. So I think we just make sure if there was a strong voice, we cover somewhere that's what a certain part of the community wants or something, but very brief, right, maybe.
Yeah, I think the problem is we tread into dangerous waters, right? Because if we start to argue, well, one community wanted this, another one, I don't think that serves us well, and frankly, it's, yes, I appreciate that there's petitions and signatures, but there's a lot of folks who might say, well, I signed that petition, but I didn't read it, I didn't understand it to say this or that. And there's a real danger in attempting to summarize what neighborhoods feel. Frankly, even in neighborhood associations that are very well developed and have bylaws and have voting rights and all of that stuff, getting a count of how many, exactly how many neighbors in a Barron Park neighborhood constitutes all of Barron Park's feels a certain way is a really dangerous thing. And I don't think it's a part of our mission, and I don't think that it's something we can stick into this report.
And people change their mind.
Yeah, and
You
it's
need a
time
mic,
dependent
We need to get
and
you a
time
mic.
dependent and also
Yeah, exactly.
story changes and.
Right,
Well,
and you'll run out of time
3
just
months
doing.
ago might be different than I think today.
Yes. Philip, did you want to say something? That was it, yeah, that people change.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you might end up missing somebody's newest, comment on it in doing that. So that is a
And the
risk.
city changes too.
And did you have you said you had 3 things. Did we get to all of those, or did we miss
The
something?
third one was kind of a meta comment, which was, I think it would help as we're writing individual sections if we had an example of the writing style that you wanted us to write in. Like either write an introduction yourselves and share that with us, or is there another report that we could sort of use as a
In other words, the
example?
voice.
Yes, the voice.
What's a good voice?
Yes. So you don't have to do all of the editing to get it all into the same voice, that we sort of are working towards that along the way.
Okay. Larry, I'm looking at you because you've been around longer than I have, and you've seen way more reports with different voices, and so I would love to hear your sage advice on how do we give this a succinct voice.
I'm not so worried about it. I think if we have some different voices, that's okay. But with uniform editing, it'll come out. You see the reports that we get all the time from AECom, from the city staff. They're sort of the model, but we can improve on them. By that I mean, this is the citizens. I don't think we need to be as bureaucratic. I think that we can write in a way that maybe your freshman English instructor would approve. If you had a good freshman English program. No, I think most people do, and that is follow those ideas. Clean writing, not a lot of technical jargon. If you can avoid technical jargon if you can, and I think we'll be okay. And if one section sounds like it was written by a different person than the next section, well, it was. That's okay.
Yeah, I have a question on 4. I think this is the most difficult section, and is there a process that you might? Oh, are we?
Yeah, well, so I think
Okay.
the,
Oh, we have to, we haven't got there yet.
right.
Is there a process? Because I'm sort of,
So
I-
I think we should probably take some sort of formal action to agree to adopt this as a skeleton table of contents that could adjust as we write if we realize, oh my gosh, we totally forgot some section or whatever. But I think formally it would be good for us to take action on that portion of it and commit to the different folks that are in each section. If you guys are all okay with where I've kind of randomly assigned you per your request last week, then that would be great. And then, Tony, to answer your question, I think after today's kind of first open discussion, I'm meeting tomorrow with Larry and Chantal and Philip to kind of think about exactly how to capture the rest of that part, because I won't know until we start actually getting into things, how that could go. And it may be as simple as, okay, here's a summary of what we thought about last week. You know, if there's some action that we were able to take, then that will help. And then what I laid in bed thinking about was, okay, let's assume that the group makes a decision on a particular alternative. Then the thing is to capture what that decision was. And let's say if it's discarding any alternative, for example, to try to, as much as possible, have each person speak to why they wanted to discard something and try to capture everybody's rationale, so that when the public reads this, it's, okay, we looked at this alternative, and each of us discarded it. It doesn't have to be, it's not going to say, Tony said he discarded it because of blah, but to kind of have a good list of what were all the reasons why, in a way that explains to the public the thinking that we went through. And if we were missing data, well, we were missing this data, and I think my vision, to the extent possible, was, I've said this before, it is possible that this may sit on the shelf for a while, or someone in 10 years from now will read it. And since I've spent the last 11 years reading reports that started a long time ago, I appreciate those little kernels of data that get left in there. So to the extent that we say, well, we didn't choose this, but we did learn the following things about this alternative that we think are worth remembering, so that if something in the future were to change and somebody 20 years from now says, why didn't they do this back then? We can capture that data in there. It helps someone not reinvent the wheel, 20 years from now. So. But that's just my personal style.
but just sooner or later, we're going to have to opine on each one of these.
That's what we're going to start today.
alternatives,
Yeah,
right? Today.
yeah. I hope you had your Wheaties.
Does someone need to move to adopt the proposed draft?
Yeah,
of
so
the
I feel bad
segments that we all agreed
because
to
Dave
wrote?
just arrived and we're about
Okay.
to.
Dave, we need you to vote.
Nadia, I want to really quickly mention that earlier we were talking about other as a 2.5, I believe.
Yes.
And I think that this is probably a more appropriate location than the 5.2 where we had it. So we'll just turn that 2.5 into 5.2 maybe? Because the 5.2 is other considerations, which is PAUSD, business, Stanford, et cetera.
I think that other considerations was more about, for example, if we came to some big aha about bike things, that would be, oh, we recommend, whatever X alternative, and in terms of bikes, we'd like you to remember the following, or in terms of ADA requirements, we'd like you to remember the following. That's what I sort of thought of that section of. So future safety considerations, because we know we can't get to that level of detail, and other considerations might be like, if you're going to build something elevated, we really think you should have sound walls, or you should think about plantings, or, whatever other might be, and that might get further fleshed out. For now, it was a placeholder. Does that seem to jive? Is that what you were
At the risk of sort of jumping in the middle of that, to the extent that that affects the recommendation coming out of XCAP, as in, which options, wouldn't it make more sense to be a part of the recommendations rather than
Yeah,
a separate section?
I put it there only because, again, poor Allison Cormack is the only one who gave sort of detailed things, but it was, what's your recommendation and rationale, and then mitigations of any known issues related to those. So as an example, if we were to recommend a closure, we might have a lot to say about well, we recognize it's going to have the following minute. So yes, it's probably, maybe that those two merge together.
Subsets of the
or subsets,
recommendations,
but-
right?
And so this is
Gotcha.
why I want to approve a temporary skeletal thing, recognizing that as we write, we might be like, you know what, this makes more sense here or there based on where the discussion goes. But that was just a kind of high-level
Understood.
placeholder.
I just have to bring out one thing. You can only mitigate things you know about. Talking about mitigations of things that you don't know about.
Your big section. With no end, a chapter with no conclusion.
So we don't have to say mitigation of existing, all we have to say is mitigations, period.
Yes.
That's
one.
Yes, I think that's what we have, so.
But
Okay,
I think that does get to a further point there. The other considerations, I think we're talking about two different types of other considerations. Phil was bringing up the considerations of what the school district is now saying, what a business group might say, and who knows what else comes down that we haven't yet talked about. So that to me is sort of a catch-all category for if something else comes up that we want to talk about, that's where it goes. Where you're talking about something else that I'm not which is that is sort of hinting at there might be things that we're recommending that are sort of outside of our purview, like, for example, if we decided to recommend a viaduct at Churchill, but also thought that the idea that the traffic engineer had brought up of expanding the intersection at El Camino and Embarcadero to hopefully eliminate that, that would be another consideration in that sense of the word.
yeah. And again, the goal is not to tell you how to run every corner of the city. I think the idea is really just to try to not lose the contextual insights that I think the community members as XCAP members have brought to this discussion that might get lost in 15 or 20 years, right? That I think, I'm focused on 15 or 20 years, people. I don't know, this week, that's what I'm thinking about, but. Okay, so Dave, I just wanted to catch you up. So we are trying to see if we can all agree to the skeletal table of contents. And then on the second page of that, we have I've assigned you and Inyang to try to write just a summary of what has been the process thus far. So, it started in this year and then we did the following. So it can be chronological, it can be in a paragraph, whatever you guys decide. And then the idea would be that if everybody who's writing sections could have it to us, I think I have March 25th on here, but sooner is always better, then that would be great, but hopefully giving everyone enough time to kind of get all that stuff done. And again, if some of you have, I know, Pat, you said you've already half written it, if you've got it sooner, great, because that way Larry and I can start really getting on that, that would be helpful, so.
Nadia, I think that we've left out a section that you ought to be the first author on, and I'm glad to assist.
Oh, God.
And that is the section 4.
Okay. What do you mean we've left it out?
Well, there's nobody who's assigned to writing.
Oh, no, you and I are basically assigned to writing it. Nice try, Larry.
Exactly. I'm working from I was working from your memo.
Oh, no.
Okay, so Nadia?
Okay, good, we got it.
I think section 4, it's just an observation, probably
Yeah.
be written somewhat differently than the others.
For sure, yeah.
And it's as much going to be the minutes of the meetings transcribed and edited, and cleaned up,
Yes.
as anything else. Just
Yes.
as
I think it's going to
observation.
be more than that, so.
Well, yes, but it's going to have to include the minutes, so we capture the comments and issues, why people.
No, I think that as I see it, it's I think I added the words rationale.
Yeah, the rationale, but.
The recommendations will be drawn directly from the minutes. Those are very straightforward. The rationale is really, or another way to put it is pros and cons. How did we get there?
But the source material, the source for those rationales will be also in the minutes presumably.
They're in the minutes and they're all, they may be in the appendices, but I think the rationale, pros and cons, whatever you want to call it, is, I don't know how many pages, but a page or two. So you're not repeating the whole
Sure.
10 weeks or 12 weeks that we're going through here in 2021. 2020, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, this group has to come to an end at some point.
Yeah, yeah, no.
in Midland Park.
Yeah, exactly. I did want to say that, Chantal, did you want to, I know the mic is not anywhere near you, and this is complicated, but we are going to be having future meetings that we're going to have better minutes on. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that will help in terms of the report writing.
Yeah, we're working on getting a minutes dictated. Yeah, transcription service.
Yeah.
So that'll be in play.
So the future meetings, part of what will help Larry and I hopefully write that section is that we will have a transcribed version of the meeting, so we can then hopefully work that through. So
Starting at the next meeting?
I don't know when it starts. Do we know when it starts?
Yeah, I think it might be the next meeting. I'm not sure.
Okay. So, okay. So does anyone want to make a motion for the skeletal table of contents and? No, not on the, we'll have to do
Oh, no, okay.
for the table of contents and then we have to get to deliberation.
You already did. Say it, repeat it again.
Hey, I've lost Nadia's attention.
Actually, so we have something tricky, which is that there's a PTC meeting tonight, and I know Carrie's going to have to leave at some point. And so technically, we usually don't take a vote until we've been able to have public comment, but since this is kind of a large item that it will include both the table of contents conversation and the deliberations piece, but I still want to be able to have Carrie be able to speak to us before she has to go. What I'll do is we'll temporarily hold the table of contents thing, and at the very end, we will take public comment before we vote, but I want to be able to start the deliberations piece if that's okay. But if I'm generally hoping that everyone's okay with this agenda and the assignments as they are. Yes, looking around the room? Okay, great. So we'll do the official vote closer towards the end, because I do want to be sure to allow for public comment in case there's some raging thing that we missed. Okay, so the next portion of the conversation is we wanted to start by looking at the alternatives, and I asked Chantal, ex-cappers behind you, you will find copies of all the fact sheets and the criteria that you should have, but I was surprised, there was a couple of you who thought that you had not seen some of the fact sheets before.
Yeah, there are like 3 that are new to me, so everyone should check it. In the future, it'd be wonderful if these had dates on them.
Yeah. These are all from November 7th, I think.
Nadia, I don't recall getting the freight one. There's 2 on the freight.
Go ahead, Philip.
These have not been revised.
Yeah, so these are all as of November 7th. So if you didn't get one, it's possible that they were passed out at a meeting and then you never kind of checked back on the fact sheet page and so didn't really see those. I would say the council adopted criteria one does have at the very bottom at least a summary of all of the costing, which I find helpful every time we're kind of talking about these. And of course, none of these include for those of you following along in the audience, they don't include the new alternatives yet because those are being reviewed. Yeah, and they're all dated as of November 7th. They've all been out since November 7th.
Do we know when we'll have fact sheets for the new ones?
Any?
Sorry, no, they're still working on that.
Okay.
Ballpark.
Yeah, the analysis is still being done, so unfortunately.
Okay, but we have to make a recommendation in like, what is it, 8 weeks? So.
Our report is due in 8 weeks. Different.
Yeah, we're working on them. We're trying to get a tightened schedule.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ed, did you want?
Well, only to be fair, noting that the alternatives themselves are still being defined.
Right.
We've had a back and forth with the proponents, the folks who brought forward the ideas, and that resulted in some changes to the concepts. And so there's some refinement that's happening between the consultant team as well as, again, the initial idea. And as the Mike's pointed out, as a result of the town hall, I think there may be some additional suggestions as to how that would all play out. Totally understand that, again, that's, at least for the time being, parallel path, but will soon become critical path in terms of your work. So we're working with the consultant team to try to get that wrapped up as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and I would just say the intent of the conversations is we can set aside those two alternatives for now, discuss the other ones, and then once we got more information, we'll kind of bring those into the fold. But the hope today, it was to start talking about South Palo Alto, so Meadow and Charleston, and we're going to ask that we're going to go around the room and have each person talk about the various alternatives and kind of where they are right now, because we've got to make some decisions soon. And so I guess the prompt would be, I'm specifically interested if there are already any alternatives that you think, if you had to, rank these in your minds, which is your lowest alternative at this point that you do not think you are likely to say we should continue supporting. And because Larry and I are chair and vice chair, we are supposed to go last. So, Carrie, since you've got to leave, I'm going to let you
Thanks,
go first.
Nadia.
I know. But if you had a question before that, because I wasn't sure if you wanted to ask something else related to the schedule.
No, just my final thoughts on the other worksheets or fact sheets is, we've considered draft documents before in this meeting. So if it's 80% done and we're still waiting for 20% of the information to come, I think it's okay to share it earlier rather than wait for it to be complete whenever you're ready.
Thanks. Yeah, I think as Ed said, they're still really just trying to make it the best concept possible, and I think there's still a lot of back and forth, but I hear you, and we will certainly work on getting those out, so thank you for that.
Sure.
Okay, so Carrie, I'll let you have at it, and everybody has as long as they need, because we're going to be doing this for several weeks, so this is our first warm-up phase, and we're hoping if we start with our least favorites, that gets us ready for the coming weeks.
If
so.
you need to rein me in, just speak
Okay.
up. So we're just talking about Meadow and Charleston?
Yeah, Meadow and Charleston, and do you have what are your thoughts on the alternatives as presented, not counting the new ones, and?
Not counting the new ones.
Yes.
Not counting the new one.
Right on. Okay, so I'm concerned that the mitigations for the water, the underground water channels are not, the engineers don't seem too excited about it, the community members don't seem too excited about it, so I'm tending to want to remove the item that interferes with our water paths the most, which I think is the tunnel for passenger and freight, because that's the deepest tunnel. So that would be the one that I would recommend to remove based on concerns that were shared by the water engineers in this meeting and at the community meeting last week.
So, Carrie, sorry, just to clarify, you mean both the South Palo Alto tunnels with and without freight? Is that correct?
You asked for my lowest ranked item, and it would be the one with both both trains subterranean because it's a deeper tunnel.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Any other thoughts on the other alternatives that you'd like to discuss?
Sure. I am also, I would like to understand better from the engineers, especially the water engineers, about the mitigations that are possible with trench or the at-grade freight options. It seems like those are, because our water is not very deep, that both of those would also have the same problems interfering as the one with both passenger and freight underground. I'd like to understand that better. Like, is it 20% better? Is it only 1% better? But I'm very concerned about that. So those are my bottom
Okay.
three. I'm very interested in the item that is not presented yet. So stay tuned.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Spam call, sorry. Okay. Do we have any volunteers for going next, or do we want to go old school style and just keep going around the table? Yeah, Pat, you're okay with that?
Yes.
Great.
When this all started, I thought the tunnel and the trench would be the alternatives that I would seek more information on. And after reviewing the fact sheets and hearing from the engineers, and as Carrie was mentioning, the water issues, also safety, because the trench and the tunnel would also still have open access, means restriction efforts would still be an issue. And of course, cost. These are by far the most expensive. And so those are my three that I feel least inclined to support.
Okay, so that would be the South Palo Alto Tunnel with and without freight and the trench, is that correct? Okay, great. Okay, Greg.
When this process started, I was skeptical about the disruption and expense of building a tunnel through Palo Alto for primarily aesthetic reasons, and I feel even more so. So my options kind of go up from the bottom. I had believed that the trench had the biggest impact on the creeks because my understanding from old fact sheets was that the trench went through the creeks while the tunnels went under the creeks. But I just looked at these fact sheets again today, and I see that in all three underground options, the creeks are affected, which I think puts a big risk of flooding on neighborhoods. It's not great for the environment. It's going to require many, many approvals from boards. I'm kind of willing to believe that it might be possible to build a not unattractive viaduct. I've never in my life seen an attractive trench. So I would be in favor of eliminating the trench and both tunnel options. And I can say lots more about this, but we don't want to take all day.
Okay.
And then that leaves hybrid and viaduct, of which I'm happy to have a longer conversation, but I can also hold off until we have more time.
Okay. I think for now, if we can all talk about our bottom three, that's helpful, and then we might be able to keep moving in the conversation, so I appreciate that. Okay, Megan.
Can I say one more thing? Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, baby. I'm a little concerned that we've been having, there are people who've been coming to like every meeting, and I think we need to give them a prize when this thing is over. But I'm a little concerned that when this process started, all of the people visiting and talking to us were from the Meadow and Charleston neighborhood. And now almost all the people who've spoken publicly about this for the last, I don't know how long, have been from the Churchill neighborhood. Mm-hmm. I'm a little concerned that we haven't heard from the Meadow-Charleston community. Some of the original members of the XCAP were here specifically to advocate for building a tunnel. And even though I just told you I really don't think we should build a tunnel of the CAP, I'm a little concerned that we haven't heard from people who are living near this for a while.
I make an observation. They were very vocal, and properly so in terms of their concerns. And maybe we haven't done a good enough job of outreach to say, folks, these are the alternatives, and they're not only the ones you favor. So without trying to take a position, at least for this minute, on the alternatives, I think maybe that identifies an issue of outreach.
Okay, Megan.
I agree with a lot of what's been said, and that what I'm thinking is that I have heard from members of the South Palo Alto communities, you know, sort of in favor of each of these options, and there's this push and pull to a lot of their comments. I'm of the agreement with the rest of the ex-captors we've heard from that the tunnel options, I think, are too expensive and do affect the water table in ways that we would like to avoid. I'm less convinced on the trench, although on not doing the trench, although I think I need to reread the fact sheet again. I am concerned that we haven't really heard from neighbors about the tiebacks that would be required.
So despite what I said a second ago. Okay, so I'm surprised that I'm agreeing with pretty much what's been said. I'm concerned about the environmental impact of the creek blockage, which, if it's bad now, it's only going to get worse in terms of global warming, water level, sea level rise, and that scares the hell out of me. I don't want to see Palo Alto become one big floodplain. I'm also concerned about the costs. I'm concerned about the number of regulatory approvals, which could delay the process for years and years. And Caltrain is probably just the least of those. In terms of the trench, So that's why I don't oppose the tunnels. I also think there's another wild card here, which is the potential for Caltrain to want to build passing tracks. And which alternatives would be most amenable to adding passing tracks. The civil engineering part of me says that tunnel would be a disaster for adding 2 more tracks, and the trench would be maybe feasible, but very hard to do in practice. Whereas the viaduct and the hybrid are relatively easy to do. So that's kind of informing my thinking. And between those two, I'm struggling, I really am. Because I hear the arguments on both sides and I have my own opinion.
Put in one thing, at the meeting, at the town hall last meeting, I tried to ask one of the AECom engineers, are there alternatives that are easier or harder to convert to 4 tracks? And he did say, well, I suppose the trench would be harder. But his answer was mostly, oh, that'll never happen. But I tried, so I think he confirmed what you just said.
Okay, well, having done some many years ago design work in that area, you'd have to excavate behind the existing trench walls and back, and it's a nightmare in practice to build. Whereas adding 2 more tracks to a viaduct or an embankment, piece of cake, relatively speaking. But I just want to make one point. At the last town hall meeting, I went to the engineers manning some of these stations and asked them what they were hearing from people. I was surprised that they were hearing favorable comments for the viaduct. Because until an earlier town hall meeting, when I would hang around listening to people talk, I would hear unfavorable comments. So I don't know yet, and I have to have a very serious conversation with myself about what I'm going to support. And that, of course, assuming Elizabeth's proposal doesn't fly.
Right.
I want to just to clarify one issue that was brought up. There's nothing that says when we build the trench that we have to build it only big enough for 2. If we anticipated 4, we could do that. So we didn't have.
But the cost
But the cost would
be very
damn near
different.
double.
Yeah.
And it might also have a real permanent impact on Alma Street.
And
I don't know.
Yeah.
There may be a lot more engineering differences with the constructability of that. Besides,
Totally agree with all that. I just want to make sure
Yeah,
that
Thank you.
the ability for us to flex on that shouldn't be
Well,
the
and-
deciding factor.
I appreciate everybody chiming in, but I do want to make it a safe space for everyone to talk about how they're thinking about things without all of
Fair
us
enough.
adding in. No, it's okay. I thought that was a good point, but I just want to make it safe so everyone feels like they can talk about what they've been thinking. So, Tony, go ahead.
So I don't think any of the alternatives that require siphon are good ones for the reasons that have been discussed earlier and many times. I think that's a fatal flaw, and anything that requires a siphon should be eliminated.
Sorry, Tony, can I have you be really specific about which ones you're perceiving to need a siphon, because everyone has different interpretations.
Yeah,
and
so
I just want to be clear.
The the trench, the tunnel, and the hybrid, probably, not sure. I would just generally align my comments with Greg. I have agreed with everything he said. I've never seen a beautiful trench, but I've never seen a really beautiful viaduct, and I think we can do that because we're being backed into those 2 choices. I think our next task is to look at how we can design these things that fit into Palo Alto and work with Palo Alto.
Okay, so, Tony, I just want to make sure I have you down correctly. So, you would be not inclined to pursue either one of the South Palo Alto tunnels or a trench, and potentially even the hybrid because it would still require pumping, is that correct? Right. Okay.
And a lot. Besides pumping, it's a lot of disruption on both the train and vehicular traffic.
Okay. All right, Keith.
I do live in Charleston Meadows, and when I walk around the neighborhood, talk to people about rail, the first thing almost everybody says is don't elevate the tracks. It's almost unanimous down there that they just do not want this. These are people who have their back fences up against the rail, and it's bad enough having the train there, but if you elevate the train another 20 feet, they just are really scared of that. That said, when you look at the below grade, there's a lot of complications with the water table. There's a lot of complications with the creek. So that said, I don't think that the tunnels are possible. I think they're just too expensive. I don't think they're realistic. Trench, part of the problem with the trench is that right now, if you look at that, we're looking at 30 feet below the surface. That's really excessive. We can trim that down. We can have a thinner deck and not as much clearance, and as a result, trim that down maybe 25, 26 feet. That reduces the impact to the creeks, and so I think before I would throw the trench out, I would want another try at that. I'm hoping that the trench is a backup plan.
Yeah.
Because I still have some misgivings about it. The tiebacks bother me. So trench is an emergency situation. Viaduct, I'm not happy with. So this, I kind of am echoing Rachel's comment of a couple of months ago. I'm not really thrilled about any of these. And if I had to pick one, assuming that the Elizabeth. Yeah.
You can just say the ones you're not into
So,
today, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, honestly, I would want an at-grade train track, which either means like what Tony was talking about or what Elizabeth was talking about, something like that. I think by far and away is better. But I would throw out both the tunnels and I would throw out the viaduct.
Yeah.
And
Keith, let me just mention that if we want to reduce the clearance under the overpass road, that might require a Caltrain exception.
I think we'd have to talk about that, because I don't think that the distance under the creeks is guided by
No,
Caltrain.
not the creeks, but the distance between the top of rail and the bottom of the overpass, that's probably, I know that's a Caltrain standard, probably could, I don't know my system here, I can look it up. So if we want to lower that, which, by the way, there's a good argument for doing that, especially with freight thrown into the equation. We'd have to have a discussion with Caltrain about
But
that.
if you could do a 2-foot deck and a 25-foot clearance, that's still 27 right now. We're
Yeah.
doing 30.
Yeah.
If you can trim that 25 down, you may be down to 25.
Yeah,
So, what I'm saying is, I think there's room
Yeah, I
for
think
improvement.
we're getting off track. I just want to hear
That's
where we
for
are,
the
and then we
engineering.
can move
So
into
anyway,
more detailed
the-
stuff.
The tunnels and the viaduct, I would take off my list.
Okay,
I have a question for Keith.
yeah.
Keith, we know that we haven't heard from your neighbors in quite a while.
Yeah.
And my observation is that as people have learned more about the various alternatives and their various shortcomings, they become more open-minded as to other alternatives that they initially rejected. So 2 questions to you. One, why haven't we heard from your neighbors in the same manner that we've been hearing from Southgate and Churchill and other neighborhoods? And second, maybe they will be more amenable if they heard some of these other things that other neighborhoods have been listening to.
I think there's 2 reasons why they're not showing up. One is that they got exhausted. And this is a long process, right? Yeah. And the other is that the options that were on the table, none of them excited them. It was like, oh, pick a lesser of 5 evils. Right? So it's.
That's what
Yeah.
we're all looking at.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, one way of saying this to your neighbors is if they really want to turn out, and they ought to do so, because I think we should regard all of our decisions, except for when we eliminate something, as still tentative. So I don't hold it to anybody when he says, or she says, that right now I'm more favorable to a viaduct or a hybrid or whatever. So I think that's why we want to have more and more discussion. So I think if your neighbors really want to have input, now's the time.
I agree.
Nadia, I have a question for Larry. Then there's a lot of right-of-way, I mean, as we reach South Palo Alto, especially along the Charleston Meadow, the dimension, there's about 130 feet, is my opinion, and the viaduct would take 48 feet of that, a two-track viaduct. Now, I'm not talking about a 4-track, and hopefully we'd never talk about 4-track. But a 2-track viaduct in that area, I think we need sections to show the neighbors what the impact could be and what could be done under that viaduct. I have an artist friend who lives between Charleston and Meadow who sculpts pieces of stone or big pieces of wood. And I think he feels like an open space there would be beneficial to him.
Okay.
So look at more details.
Well,
actually.
again, I'm just trying to, I think today, get a sense of where everybody is and see if there's any, consensus on at least some movement. And so this is all helpful, so thank you. Inya?
Okay, so I would eliminate viaduct because I think viaduct's ugly, everybody agrees, and more people really think about it. It provides solution, but, visually, noise, changing characteristic of Palo Alto city, so I'm against the viaduct.
For the south, just to clarify.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm against on the Churchill side. I want to be
I just wanna be
consistent.
sure we're all on the same page.
And I say it strongly because I've been thinking about it in my street, which is Churchill. So, I could,
By the way, just to be clear, the rest of us are not being consistent, so if I made positive statements about a viaduct in the south of Palo Alto, that doesn't mean I'm voting for a viaduct in Churchill, at least not today.
I think we know all the reasons why we don't want viaduct, so I'm not going to go into detail, but that's my first thing I would eliminate. And then second one, I would, the trenching and the tunnel, because, I think a tunnel, I consider 4-track, passables, and, it's, if I already know that I have to provide a 4-track, why would I do tunnel for $1 billion? So I would eliminate that. And I would eliminate the, the trench, because I think a trench is, if we do trench whole Palo Alto, I think maybe a nice solution, but this trench is gonna go up and down, and, I think practicality, and you spend about $900 million to do this, to, hodgepodge of the section of Palo Alto, I don't think it's worth it. So 3 I would eliminate.
Actually, by my count, 4, right? So viaduct, trench, and both tunnels, the South Palo Alto tunnel with and without freight, which is 2 options.
Right,
So
right,
4.
4.
Okay.
But I think so there's only one option left, which is hybrid.
Yeah, yes. Okay, Dave?
Yeah, pretty much agreeing with what a lot of everybody said here, with maybe a slight difference on one point. Probably my top 3 to eliminate would be the tunnels and the trench. I think mainly for cost reasons, because it's just so expensive. But also, I'm very concerned about the train changing grade, even at 1 or 2%, and at the speeds they're going at. Even if we got an exception, I can't imagine what it would be like racing somewhere and then going, whoa, up into like a roller coaster and back down again. With your stuff, yeah. Put your arms up and have fun, right? I'm just not sure that that's a good idea in general. I'm surprised to hear Phil's comments from what he heard, and I could see where people who didn't live near the train would say this, that the viaduct is great and everything. But, I've talked to a lot of those folks that Keith has talked to, and we have a lot of folks in our neighborhood too, that just having that train up in the sky like that, 20, 30 feet up, it's just not agreeable to their backyards, right? It's not a good thing for them. So potentially I'm saying there's 4 that I would be against here, adding the viaduct to the trench and the tunnels.
Okay, Adina, welcome. I know you just walked in. Do you want a little, I'm sure you figured out what we're doing, which is Carrie filled you in. Okay.
Yes, and so I was coming from a meeting where I was learning the latest and greatest about how Caltrain is looking to fund the next set of frequency improvements.
Oh, great. So we'll have you give us an update during the second part.
Which is a little bit of motivation to have this move forward. And similar to what the people that I have heard say since I got here, are the trench and tunnel options, looking at the, what the region is looking at in terms of funding for regional transportation, like even if we wind up passing a large regional transportation measure, which I think is looking iffy for 2020, but, quite possible in the foreseeable future, the amount of money that was in for all of the Caltrain grade separations was looking pretty onerous, even at the level of a lot of regional transportation funding. And so adding on to the extra cost of even if we have supplemental funding from the region, the extra cost of those options is pretty substantial. And then also looking at what Palo Alto is looking to do with a business tax, where the council preference moving forward was $10 million a year. And that would go a long way towards paying a local match for some of the ones that aren't at the top tier of the expense, but is also basically looking pretty out of reach. So, and then the other thing in terms of the cost of the underground options, as well as practicality, are the water issues, because needing to, it's not just about the difficulty of doing it, but the fact of needing to pay the operating cost of that, which would, because Caltrain has said that they wouldn't pay for it, because it doesn't help them, like grade separations helps them from a transportation perspective, but the underground ones don't help them anymore, and so they wouldn't pay for it, so that would be costs that would go to the city of Palo Alto in the operating budget. So having something that's, competing the pumping of the water from a trench with the money that's being used from like the library and other public services that people really value, I think that's another challenge that puts those things kind of out of reach. And in terms of the hybrid and the, I guess if I've said the three least favorite, I don't need to express any more.
We're starting on the easy ones.
All right.
Or relatively easy ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Yes.
We keep bringing up this business license tax and tying it to rail. Are those two tied, or I thought they were
So
separated?
I wanted to follow my own rule of not opining on what Adina said, but I think the purpose of this discussion is to understand where everybody is on their recommendations. People have feel differently about different things. Some people know more about funding things. Some people know less. But I think we're supposed to base our decisions also just on what we feel is Palo Altans, regardless of where the money may come from. And so I just I don't want to take away from what Adina's experience is, but our conversation is not at this time bound by any specific number. And I'm sure we'll get to that when we start to discuss the other options and feasible and funding and the criteria kind of stuff. Yeah, Megan.
I had a quick question related to what Dave said, which was, do the folks that have been following Caltrain, are there any places along the corridor, like these other hybrids in San Mateo County, where it is at a higher grade, at a 1.5, 2% grade?
That's a good question. Has anyone else been granted design exception?
Does anyone know?
Terry, yeah, we've got Terry Lightfoot from Caltrain, who happens to be. Oh, Jim Lightfoot, sorry. I'm baptizing people even up here. I'm taking full reign.
There was an exception granted for the San Bruno.
Sorry, you know what? Could I have you go to the mic so that we can make sure we record what you're saying and it gets on the record? Thank you. Yeah, just make sure you press the button.
Jim Lightbody with Caltrain. There was a design exception for the San Bruno, I guess you'd call it hybrid grade separation in the northern part of city of San Bruno. I don't remember the exact, but it was maybe like 1.4% or something like that.
Has there also been exemptions granted for the potential things into Trans Bay that would apply to only
Yes, of course,
only?
the San Bruno has been constructed, so that's in place. The exception, design exception in San Francisco was related to the fact that there was no freight and the alignment was very restricted, so they approved an exception there also, but that's still yet to be built.
Right, okay. And actually, as long as I have you here, we
Uh-oh.
have it's okay if the answer is I can't answer this at this time, but it is a question that has been raised at a previous meeting, which is that I can't remember if it's the viaduct or the hybrid that we've looked at, shows the tracks moving to the side to be able to build the viaduct without needing viaduct, right? Without needing shoe fly tracks. And while I know that the curvature that the AECOM consultants have looked at meets the sort of typical Caltrain requirements, we did have an outstanding question that I think we raised it with Sebastian, but we'd still love to get an answer at some point from Caltrain, which is that still something that Caltrain considers okay, or is it true that you need to straighten out the tracks as much as possible in general, and that would not actually be okay?
We haven't specifically looked at that yet, but in general, if the design curves and everything are accommodated, it should be okay. But that would be something Caltrain would want to make sure we looked at closely, if that's one of the alternatives.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Yep.
So one more piece of information, as somebody was expressing concern about a roller coaster. There's actually some examples in our area where the train goes up and down, and you can think if you use the train and do you feel it? So in who's taken BART to San Francisco and has connected at Millbrae? And so coming into Millbrae, there's it goes up, it goes down, and at least somebody who does that, like, I don't notice the fact that it's going up and down, other than the fact that sometimes you have a view and sometimes you're underground. So
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Dina. I think it's a common, for non-engineers, it's a common concern, but the reality is if Caltrain has said that fits within their restrictions, then it means that it would be imperceptible to anybody riding the train. So while for us non-engineers, it goes to 2% and 1% and it goes up and it goes down, matters not to the train. I think the best example I have is if you actually drive on the 101, there are points where the 101 goes down dramatically and goes back up. It actually goes under some of the freight rail tracks, I've noticed. And you just don't even notice it when you're driving. And it's because it meets the engineering standards. So I think that's an important point because it's something that has come up before. So thank you for that. Okay, at this time, Larry and I are left to speak, but in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we get some public comment. So I wanted to hear from everybody that wanted to give public comment. Can I have a show of hands of how many folks want to speak to this item? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Great. So if I can get folks to line up so we can go expeditiously, that would be great. Yeah, you'll have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Eileen Fagan again from Southgate. I will admit, I'm going to make a kind of an overall comment on this process because I've been a business person for 35 years. I find it incredibly difficult to listen to all this with the very first discussion item when we said there are no measurable criteria. I don't even know why we're talking about eliminating options. It's a lot of opinion, and there's not measurable criteria. So, Ed, I think that it's really important that this whole process be driven around criteria and long-range thinking, because it doesn't feel that way when you listen to it. Now, I get it, you guys might be doing that, but even writing a report or recommendations without measurable criteria, I cannot think of a boardroom that would be okay with that. A CEO staff that would be okay with that. I sat in those meetings for years and years. I mean, like, I'm a little shocked. And so my recommendation very strongly is not to be talking about eliminating options, but go back to where are the measurable criteria that are very long-term and that are agreed upon by the city as the most important things. And then this will all be a better process. But the thought that you're writing a report and recommendations and even eliminating options based on opinion is a little disturbing.
Next.
Well, I am. I do live on Alma near Loma Verde, so I am representing to some extent. And I can tell you that my ideas about opposition to a viaduct have not changed. I think that is the worst solution in terms of how it would impact the city and my neighborhood. I understand, or it does seem to me, based on the water issues, that the trench, which is what I would prefer, and the tunnels are not going to be a viable solution. As a matter of fact, I was totally in despair until your last meeting when you came up with your new alternatives, which we can't talk to tonight. To some extent, I had the feeling that everybody wanted to wipe out all 5 alternatives, and I totally support that because I think they're all awful. And I have hope that the 2 suggestions you've come up with, which are the essentially underpasses that only affect the 2 intersections themselves, will in fact turn out to be practical and that you can go forward with that. I don't know what kind of water issues there are going to be with that, but it seems like the cheapest, it seems like the least, that would least impactful on the neighborhood. So that's where I'm coming from, but absolutely no viaduct. That's the worst.
Thank you. Next.
Yes, in keeping with, sometimes I add clarity to a couple items talked about. I think on the San Bruno, it's just the north side that got the design exception because there was a 380 overpass to the San Bruno road and stuff. So it's not both ends of that got the exception and stuff, just as clarity. And then, passing tracks, I'm sorry I wasn't here for when Sebastian came here, but I've seen in other meetings, and that's why I'm bringing this up, is the passing track conversation kind of is a pointing the finger conversation. I go to high-speed rail meetings. We don't need passing tracks for our stuff. Go to Caltrain meetings. We don't need passing tracks for our stuff. But ultimately, the Caltrain business plan, even if you strip out high-speed rail, if they did the ultimate, that high-growth one, and you got Dunbarton Rail and some other stuff, if you want a synchronized schedule, like clock schedule every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, just the math of running trains, you need passing tracks somewhere in the zone, exactly where they're at till to BD. But it's not, if we want Caltrain, if we want the operations to work well so we ride it, there's just a need there, and it's not about like pointing which way. It's just, that's something I've just seen a lot where it gets pointed both ways. No one wants to own that kind of thing and stuff. So thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name's Renee, and I live on the tracks. And I just want to second what Keith said. I live between Charleston and Meadow, and we do not, our neighborhood does not want the train up 50 feet, 100%. There were a lot of people that participated for a long, long time, and like Keith said, we just couldn't do it. I've had major surgery and recovered from it since we started this process. So that's part of the reason, and now I'm back. But I just want you to know so that we're hearing from South Palo Alto. We do not want that.
Thank you, Renee. Roland, and is there anybody else who wants to line up behind Roland so I can get a count of how many are left? That'd be great. Go ahead, Roland.
So,
Roland, go ahead. Okay, could we get quiet in the audience so poor Roland can start? Roland, go ahead.
So I was on the same meeting and the same train as Adina, and it's not $10 billion, it's actually 30. We are going to be paying 60% out of the total of these taxes that are talking about 1/8 of the sales tax. But the reason Adina said 10 million is that they're going to split our surplus of $30 million 3 ways. And I happen to disagree. I believe that $30 million should stay in Santa Clara County. Trench, freight, passenger grace, passenger and tellers, yada, yada, yada. I say from the beginning, none of these AACOM solutions were ever going to work. And if I hadn't believed so, I would never have got involved in this and actually presented an alternative that's going to, I believe, will work. Trains going up and down, well, why don't you ride between London and Paris and go to London tunnels? You're going to see when you're going to come out in Stratford International go down again. Do you know what the grade is when you come out of the final tunnel? It's 3.8%. Any of you noticed it? No, of course you didn't. Now, it's bizarre that you had the point here when you're going to be eliminating alternatives where right now you don't have a viable solution for Charleston. And I believe that's the reason why you had to cancel tomorrow night's meeting. And last but not least, what I suggest that you do is to study the RFP that the San Francisco Transportation Authority issued last night for the 16th Street grade separation, which is known as the Pennsylvania Avenue Extension. You'll never believe who is going to bid for this. This is a $1 million contract for 1 year, and they spent $600,000 drafting the RFP.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Can I clarify something that Roland just said that I said, which is different from what I said? Just so
Well,
nobody's
why don't we
confused?
finish public comment, and then I'll let you,
Okay.
I'll come back to you, Adina. Go
I
ahead.
was going to say, in terms of reaching out and hearing from people, many people live in Palo Alto, work, or have children, and they can't come to meetings that start at 4 or 5 or 6 o'clock because they're either still at work. Incredibly, Valley jobs make you work many long hours. And if you have children, you're not leaving at dinner time. So I would suggest if you're serious about reaching out to the different communities, you think about going to PTA meetings and getting on the agenda at Gunn or JLS or Green or any number of the schools, or Pally, because then you will find people where they are.
I'm not using my own mic. Do we have anybody else who wants to comment on this item? Okay.
Could I ask a quick question just in terms of what will happen next? Is it the plan to make some decision?
So
as it relates
Larry
to
and
this?
I are left to speak, and
Okay.
then we have a two-step. One is we're going to talk about the table of contents and get a motion about that, and then it sounds like we've got some unanimous decision-making here, so we'll try to make a motion on that as
Gotcha.
well.
Okay,
That's the
and I
plan.
just wanted to note that I will need to leave. I've got a 6 o'clock meeting. We had a little bit of follow-up on the town hall that we'll share, and yeah, I guess I'll leave that to Philip and Chantal.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got to go and you
Okay,
want to say
so
something, yeah.
Just real quick, perhaps quick follow-up on the town hall. Just wanted to say thank you for everyone that was involved. Lots of, I'll call it improvisation, that was perhaps necessary just to make sure everything came together, including, I appreciate Mike Chacon and two mics, as I say, figuring out how to get onto a table and participate in that discussion. I would note, just as a personal perspective, as I mentioned at the meeting, really constructive feedback and good discussion on the options that did were being discussed, including the new idea at Charleston and Meadow in particular, that was cornering me literally in the corner of the room as we were talking about various options with several XCAP members as well. And one of the questions I think that came up was that we did provide some notification to the properties that were shown as potentially acquired, full acquisition. So I have copies of the letters that were left at door hangers. Kind of the nature of the real-time communications that were happening, that once we realized that the best way to provide an update to the community was to actually share the drawings that were being discussed with the technical group and the like, that was my decision, that I would rather have a door hanger left on the home that was being discussed rather than that homeowner find out about it either from the press or from a neighbor. So for that reason, I made the call and asked staff to go ahead and leave this letter at the door. I think if, as imperfect as it was, it accomplished the goal, which was to ensure that we at least tried to get the word out to them directly before the discussion happened, and didn't have us kind of looking over our shoulder, wondering if someone was going to say, what? No one told me about this, and this is my home. We had a little bit of that, but I think that that's to be expected. But again, it wasn't from those that were shown with the acquisitions. And so again, I think it was a very constructive discussion. Just one other note, the other letter that we have for you was one that I read about in the paper this morning. A memo from the school district superintendent, and I think we've got copies of that. The superintendent did give us give the memo to us yesterday afternoon, contrary to what the Post reported, it wasn't last week. And this was at the XCAP's request to get a perspective from the district, so we've got that to share as well. Okay.
Sorry, did you say that the door hangers were put on those whose properties would be a full, or not a partial?
Full, correct.
Only full, okay.
Or
And did
I should say full or potential full,
okay,
or we're taking like entire backyard
okay,
or looking at, in the initial.
okay. But not anyone who's had partial or
No slivers or
temporary.
partials.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, thank you for that. And does the audience get some of these as well?
Ed, which option, the property taking of which option, the roundabout option or?
There were two versions of the roundabout, one at, is it Melville? And one that was a half block to the west.
Oh, Mumford?
Mumford, sorry,
Okay.
Mumford.
Okay.
Half block to the west, so there was one with the half block to the west. So it was really impinging primarily on backyards. But again, I think we gave notices, door hangers to those homes as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, Adina, you wanted to clarify something.
Oh, yeah, the taxes that I was talking about in the comment about the options wasn't about the amount that was being described for a Caltrain tax that would be put on the ballot by Caltrain. I was actually referring to the local tax that Palo Alto City Council has been contemplating putting on the ballot for Palo Alto transportation and possibly housing needs. And so the $10 million per year was the amount that Palo Alto City Council had said was the level that they were considering.
Potentially, yes, thank you. Chantal, did you have something?
Yeah, we had if we were just doing the town hall update as a whole, or we can come back to that. Yeah. So, yes. I think a handout went around, and we just wanted to say that's the summary of the punch card people filled out at the town hall. So we
Right,
can
so-
talk about that at that item later, but
Yeah.
since you have a piece of paper in front of you, I
Right,
wanted you
just
to
so
know
everyone knows what
was.
that is. Okay, so I'm going to bring it back to us. So Larry, you and I should go, and then we can make motions.
Well, I agree with the comments made by Phil, and I think Gary and a few others. So I would eliminate the two tunnels and the trench at this point. And I think the criteria for evaluating those are overwhelming. There are two criteria that really stand out to me. One is the water problems. And I would even go further, since we've heard some interesting testimony from our consultants, our volunteer consultants, the retired civil engineers, as to the difficulties you have, the surprises you get when you start digging underground, and the cost. The cost here are way out of bounds compared to the other criteria. So those things, I think, far outweigh anything else you might want to consider at this particular point. We have a difficult decision ahead of us as to which ones we really prefer, because I think that there's a great consensus that there is no really desirable alternative. I like to remind myself of the campaign we had 10 years ago when we passed a library. It's very easy to pass a big bond for a library. People love libraries. People say, oh, I went to the library a lot when I was a kid. I've never heard anybody say, I went to the grade separation.
But they do.
So my view is that I would eliminate the two tunnels and the trench at this point.
Thank you, Larry. So I agree basically with what Larry said, and to the person that was wondering that we're doing these things without criteria, I think it is actually because of this criteria that I am eliminating the trench and the two South Palo Alto tunnels. I mean, you've got a lot of concerns about water and costs. The only thing that I do want to mention is that I think there were still some technical questions. I mean, I think Keith alluded to some of them, both about some of the assumptions that were used for the trench and some of the assumptions that were used for the South Palo Alto Tunnel. And if we are to make a motion today to eliminate those options, I would really want to ensure that while we can eliminate them, we also capture some of the future engineering questions or criteria, not future, but the questions that we had remaining, that even though we may not pursue any further engineering on those things, but we noted might be something that if this doesn't get built in 50 years and somebody has to come back to it, they might want to take a closer look at. I want to do the best that we can in trying to capture the questions that we did have about some of the trench assumptions and some of the tunnel assumptions. Specifically, I mean, Roland has raised several, right? But I just wanted to, I think it'd be important to capture those. So I think first we should probably make a motion about, again, going back to the table of contents for the report. And if everybody is okay, Larry, can you want to take a stab at the motion for the table of contents, or somebody else, anybody?
Carrie started it. Greg started it. Sorry, Greg.
Yeah.
So it's a very simple motion. The motion is that we adopt the table of contents here presented by Nadia and Larry as the draft working table of contents for our report, and that we agree that we'll each work on the sections so denoted.
And I'm sorry, I just realized that, Adina, you were not here when we went through that. So before we actually try to take a vote, I just want to be sure you are okay working with Phil to write the section that you and I had discussed about kind of what is Caltrain's general plan. Is that amenable? Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, great. Does we have a second? Megan seconds? Okay, great. So all those in favor? Aye. That's a unanimous vote. I don't know who, do we have anyone missing? No, we've got, everybody's here. Yay, our first unanimous decision. Carrie's not here. Oh, darn it. We're so close. Okay.
She told me before 6 o'clock she can come.
Oh, okay, we've got 4 minutes. We can make this happen if we can have, sorry, this is just very exciting.
First and last?
Yeah, and shh. You're not getting any candy, Phil. Oh, okay, we pulled, Carrie has 4 minutes, okay. Good. Chantal, you want to read the motion?
The motion restated is, yeah, I love that you included that you guys will work on it in your motion, so now it's solidified. But adopt the table of contents presented today as the draft working table of contents and agree that the XCAP will each work on the sections. The motion was made by Greg and seconded by Megan.
Okay, all those in favor? Yay! Okay, now it's unanimous. Thank you all. Thank you, Carrie, for coming back for that.
Any other motion?
Sure, we could try the second one. Okay, the second motion, Larry, I don't have any verbiage for this, so. And I won't be as good as you will be about motion making.
Well, there's a choice between doing it one by one or trying for all three, so let's try for all three and see what happens. I would move that we eliminate the 2 tunnels and the trench from consideration.
I have a clarification.
Okay, clarification from Chantal.
Just procedurally, because the council actually officially takes things off the table from consideration. So this would be from either
Recommendation.
XCAP's consideration or in your recommendation or to propose to the city council. One of those 3 clauses would be good to
Well,
have in the
I
motion.
think that's a good point for all of our motions. I think all of our motions right now are for us internally. And when we get to the end, we'll be making a motion.
So you're proposing that we do not recommend any of those 3 adoptions to the city council?
Right, that we adopt them from further consideration by
Okay.
us.
Okay.
By us, yeah.
So move to eliminate the 2 tunnels and trench from XCAP consideration. Is that short enough?
And Tony seconded?
Thank you.
Okay, all those in favor?
Should we have some discussion?
Aye, Megan?
Yeah, why you ask for discussion?
Oh, sorry, yes, thank you. Asking for discussion.
I actually do feel like, since we're doing this for the record, this is the first time in this process that we've actually decided on something, and I don't think we were sure how we all felt, because we've all kept our cards very close to the chest. So the fact that we're making a decision, I think, is significant. I don't know how many meetings this group and the CAP has had, and how many hours we've spent. But there was some discussion that this is a flip decision we're making based on our personal opinions. We've spent a lot of time, reviewed a lot of data, and I think that I obviously agree with this, but this is based on the criteria that was given to us by the council. It's just my personal statement. Thank you.
Carrie, did you want to have any discussion? Okay, because I know she's got to go. So.
I'd like to say I was surprised by the high degree of agreement among us in terms of our reasons. I expected a lot more disagreement.
Well, we've got a long ways to go.
I know, and that's why I made this, and that's why I made the snippy comment I did a few minutes ago. But this is wonderful. And yes, we have done an awful lot of work. I think that's an important indicator, the fact that we were so closely aligned.
I think removing the trench is premature unless we have high confidence that the at-grade, leaving the rail at grade will work. If we have confidence that the at-the-grade will work, then I do have misgivings about the trench. I think it's better than the elevated options.
Okay.
So I would not support taking the trench out at this point until we get the final at-grade. I agree that there are issues with the trench, but it's the lesser of two evils when you compare it to elevated rail.
Okay.
Okay, I think that in light of that position, I'll modify my motion just to eliminate the two tunnels and have a separate motion on the trench, so that we'll see how that goes. So that way we can be clear as to what everybody's position is. Is that okay
Great.
with my seconder?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, you got the modification? Okay. Do you want to speak to does anyone else want to speak to this motion, or does anyone have any? Yeah. Pat?
I just wanted to reiterate how much hard work we have done since August 15th of 2018. That's when we first started meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Okay. All right. So the motion is to remove the two South Palo Alto tunnels. All those in favor? Aye. It's unanimous. Great. Okay, perfect. Thank you. No, I'm looking at Carrie.
I divided the motion, so.
Sorry, yes, go ahead.
So the motion on the floor now is to eliminate the trench. Sorry? Eliminate the trench, yeah. Oh, no, it's, okay, it's already there.
Okay.
Okay.
I support this. However, we did discuss early on having this committee operate on a principle of consensus. And if there's no need for us to vote right now on this particular thing, even though I'm the one who always says let's make some decisions, perhaps now is not the time.
I would second that, or Greg's comment. I think as much as I'd like to make some movement forward, I do want to hear more about what the concerns are about the trench and what other information we need as a group to kind of go forward. Because if there's, I mean, I thought it was interesting, some folks were ready to also eliminate the viaduct. And so I'm hearing there was definitely consensus on the South Palo Alto tunnels. There's a little bit of movement on some of the other things, and we may get there when we get more information, but it would be important for me to understand what are the stuff we need to get more comfortable.
I mean, I think the time will probably come when we have to make votes where we are split, and there's a minority and a majority opinion. But if we don't have to do that today, maybe now is not the time.
Well, the time is not very far off. So I'm okay for a week or two, but I think that the burden is on Keith and anybody else who shares his views to really come forward with some compelling arguments, because as I count votes around the table, I think right now there is consensus, because consensus means 2/3 under our bylaws, and I think that I've heard at least 8 people say that they would eliminate the trench today. So I think almost as a matter of courtesy to you and whoever else shares that view, we'd be saying, okay, we've heard your concerns, back it up, find out what to make, do something to make us change our minds.
So can I speak to my second? I think the trench, firstly, I'll speak to the ugliness because it's going to need walls on either side, both security as well as sound. That's above grade and not great. The main issue for me is the pumping of water or the siphoning. This will damage fish, it'll damage wildlife, and I can't get there to vote for a trench, so.
I'd like to add, being the super optimist that I am, about system failures, meaning the 100-year floods that seem to be occurring very frequently these days, or maybe even the 1,000-year floods that are going to start happening, that could overwhelm the pumping or siphoning system, along with the maintenance costs that come from the over-silting that will occur when we have these heavy floods, which would lead to short-term flooding. You know, the system could break down under the impact of those heavy rains.
So.
And couple that with sea level rise, and I'm scared.
Actually, before that, I've had a few offline conversations with folks, or actually one or two, I think, who had more information about the pumping. And I know some of you have not all seen the fact sheet. Keith, did you want to talk about what you spoke to one of the engineers about and why you might have some thoughts that it doesn't sound like Tony shares, for example, that might be helpful for us to understand?
Yeah. Well, talking about the pumps, where is the trench? Okay. I've got it here, yeah. So some of the early designs of the trench showed the pipes coming up. So all the water that would come, for example, down Adobe Creek would hit a pump and go elevated up above the trench and come back down. And at the last meeting, I was talking to the water guy, and he said, no, that's not a good design. They would not consider it. He thinks the better design is to go for the pumps actually to go down. And instead of just being a passive siphon, is actually an active siphon. So you're using pumps to drive the water under the trench. The nice thing about that is if you have a power failure, at least you have some passive water flow through there. Whereas if you're relying on electricity to pump over it, even in a slight rain, if your power goes out and you're not pumping, your trench has become a dam. So the current design would be that you would have a siphon, a powered siphon. The nice thing about power siphon is that it doesn't accumulate the same sediment that you would have in a passive siphon. But still, you'd have to get it through regulatory, Fish and Wildlife, and whenever you're messing around with the creeks, it's not trivial. So there still would be regulatory issues, but you most likely would not have the pump that goes over like the original design did.
And so, Keith, if I understood you correctly, what your concern is certainly you've heard from your neighbors that we shouldn't go elevated, and so
Correct.
you're thinking about Elizabeth's idea, but if all those fail, then this is sort of the last potential underground that you think might be workable.
If Elizabeth's or Tony's idea is where you leave the rail as is, if both those don't pan out, then I'm left with a lot of options that I really don't like, and I think scrubbing the trench would be my first choice then.
So I'm in looking at these fact sheets, and I don't speak water. So it's listed as the lowering of the tracks will require the diversion of Adobe and Barron Creeks, resulting in the need for lift stations / siphons and numerous regulatory agencies, permits, and approvals. And then later on it says pump stations will also be needed for dewatering because the trench will be below ground. What I don't understand from the picture is that they have they have they have two things that are labeled lift stations.
The lift station that's OBE. The lift station was the original design where you're actually taking all the water that's coming down the creek and lifting it over.
Okay.
Now you would actually be putting a forced siphon.
So I guess the question is, why don't can we verify with AECom whether what the AECom rep kind of talked offline with him about? Because I know not everyone that was assisting at the town hall meeting was necessarily the folks exactly on this team. So for example, we had the sound guy who pointed out that one picture had a sound wall and the other one didn't. So even though they're the folks that are experts in those categories, they're not necessarily Etty or Millette. And so it would be helpful if staff could bring back clarification from AECom about whether we're talking about siphon lifts. Keith, I'm looking at you to see if I'm asking this question correctly. We want to confirm whether it's a siphon lift or what's the other word? Whether it's a lift station or a siphon?
Siphon, yeah.
Okay.
He called it a powered siphon, yeah, or a pump
Okay.
siphon.
Can we, yes, staff is nodding yes, that we will try to get follow-up on that, because I think that seems like it might help inform our discussions more. Okay. So based on that,
I would move that we continue consideration of the elimination of the trench until our next meeting, when we consider our options with regard to Meadow and Charleston.
okay. Is that a replacement motion, Chantal is
No,
asking?
it's a motion to continue, which takes priority.
Okay.
I have a question about the motion, which is there particular information that we want to glean about the trench? Is this just about like going and then comparing between the trench and the other options on the table, or is there additional information to glean about whether the trench will be considered viable or not? And I heard the question that you were saying about the pump versus the lift station versus the siphon, and so I understand what those words are, but what I don't understand yet is what the difference that makes in terms of, is this considered an acceptable solution or not? Those are
Okay.
two questions, yeah.
Keith, I'll let you take an attempted explanation of the why.
As designed right now, I would find this unacceptable because the lift station requires a constant pump, and any failure of that pump causes the trench to become a dam. If you had at least a passive siphon during a power outage, then at least as designed, it's not great, but it's not a showstopper. But I still, I think it becomes feasible if you now say we don't need 30 feet top of rail to top of roadway clearance. If we can shrink that down to 25 feet, let's say. Now all of a sudden, instead of blocking most of the creek, you're blocking very little of it. And then you could conceivably widen that creek and not have any impact to the creek. Because you just need enough flow under that bridge to match what's coming down. So that kind of scrubbing, I think, would be a potential way of making this work if the rail at grade options do not work.
So one of the things that you said about is the reliability. So I understand that the passive would be more reliable than the active pumping. Would the passive version still have the operating costs to the city? And would the passive version still have the issues with the wildlife and the environmental challenges of getting the thing approved?
So there really are three designs, and let's separate them. What's on the paper here, what's on the paper modified with replacing the lift station with an active pump. And the third one is decreasing the depth of the trench so that you can eliminate the siphon altogether. The last one would not have the wildlife issues. You would now be, as you go under that, you would have to widen out the creek, but you would still have size that creek to be able to get the full flow under the trench.
Got it, okay. Thank you for
Okay,
explaining that.
but the first two will still have wildlife issues.
Okay, and then with those, somebody mentioned a different issue with the trench. And look, what I'm trying to do here is to isolate the different issues that might affect people's decisions. Is the type of fencing that would be needed for a trench, are there good illustrations of that somewhere in our copious materials that I apologize, I do not have a memory of every single image that we've ever seen?
I would think that wouldn't the fencing be exactly the same it is right now? You're just fencing off the rail, whether the rail's in a trench or whether the rail's at surface. You're gonna have to have a
There
fence.
is a question about so there's the fencing, but there is a question about the vegetation that's possible. So today we have vegetation on the fencing, and I think the trench requires tiebacks, and they've clearly said that like we couldn't have certain trees and whatnot hiding that. But they've never said whether you could have vines similar to what we have today. I think it's sort of a question mark.
Right, so
So-
there's vegetation, and then there's also the, like, would it be the same as it is today, even considering the poles and wires that are needed for
No.
electric service? So that was, I will finish the question and then listen to the answer. That was one of the things that affected the decision in Burlingame, because they needed to have fences that were tall enough to shield things from falling onto the electric poles and wires. So they were, at least there, considered more unsightly than what we have now. So how does the fencing need relate for this trench with keeping things off the poles and wires relate to what we have now?
Yep, Philip?
Yeah, I was just going to say that in the fact sheet, it shows a 12-foot permanent fence on the typical example, and it's also on the animation. There's you can see the
Right,
fence.
what do we have now?
8 foot tall.
Okay, so now it's 8, and it would, now it's 8, and it would go to 12 because of the, like, protecting the poles and the wires. Okay, thank you.
But in this photograph, it also shows the west side of the tracks as a typical backyard. And I actually took a picture of the backyards on Charleston and Meadow on the west side, and the fencing is highly irregular and very.
So, I mean, I'm glad we're having this conversation because this is a very important decision that has later on. So, just if we're going to our city council criteria, in addition to the water issues, the cost estimate for the trench is twice as much as the viaduct. Requires, 6 years of construction instead of 2 or 4 years of construction. And the current design has tiebacks, which require property easements, which will require people to cut down trees and I think lose a few swimming pools. None of those are, giant hardships, but those are, property impacts. So, we went kind of fast in the beginning, and I think we might have thrown some people, but, there are a lot of arguments against the trench, but I'm glad we're having this conversation and not making a decision quickly.
Is there any other technical data that the group can think about that we would want to request that staff gets from AECom in order to have a more thorough discussion next week?
Wouldn't be next week. Next week, we're going to focus on.
On Churchill?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, looking at this,
Use your mic.
I don't know if we don't have the agenda yet for March 11 or 18. I thought we were not having a meeting on the 18th.
No, we are.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we have a meeting every Wednesday.
Yeah, we're meeting.
I thought we were taking one off.
We took one off already, so it's from now till this gets done that we have one every week. So
Okay.
we do have, the proposed agendas, which you guys all have, is that we have the meeting next week and then a meeting on March 11th. The one on the 11th will also have an update from staff for the remaining XCAP questions and potentially AECom to present an update to us about new alternatives and any ideas or any pictures they might have, and/or potentially an update to the matrix. And then the 18th is when the sections are written, are due. Let me just correct myself and make sure everyone got that. For those of you writing sections, the due date is March 18th, not the 25th, which I had said before. So it's the 18th, just to be very clear. Sorry, Larry, did that answer your?
No, that's fine. I think that means that we would take up Charleston and Meadow again, either on March 11 or March 18th, depending how things went, which means that, well, what I would suggest is that Keith work with staff to precisely word those 3 questions, and hopefully we can get an answer from AECom by the March 11 or March 18th meeting, so that we can move along.
Well, so I have a question. We could certainly flip back and forth between the two sides of the two parts of Palo Alto, but it may be more efficient to at least try to get through as much as we can and finish with South Palo Alto to maybe get down to our ranked top 2 or 3 while we're waiting for the next bit, because we've still got, based on what we've heard, the popularity of the Churchill options rely heavily on one of the new alternatives for which we may not have data yet. And so we may at least be able to get through discussions about our preferences of a hybrid versus a viaduct in South Palo Alto sooner than we might be able to get to the Churchill part.
Well, I don't, my guess is that we're not going to get responses from AECom on those 3 questions by next week.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually what we were just discussing. I think that might be a challenge.
It might be a challenge
It could be, yeah.
to figure out whether it was a siphon or a.
I'm not sure that one might not take quite as long, but
Okay.
the depth question might be a longer issue.
Okay, well, okay.
A week is actually not a real week.
Yes, agreed. Okay, well, I mean, I guess part of it could be that, well, all right, why don't, and this is the tricky thing, right? Trying to understand what to schedule which week and which discussions we're going to have. So we do have, the agenda does have time to be able to talk about the, do working group updates and discuss a little bit the town hall meeting, and we've got about 20 minutes for that. So I think we've got at least another good 15 minutes of conversation that we could have related to this issue generally. So did we want to discuss as a group what our feelings are in terms of the 2 elevated options and kind of wade our feet into in Charleston and Meadow to talk about, okay, well, how are folks thinking about hybrid versus a viaduct, and, you know, where folks are. So we'll have a better sense of whether, if we can get a technical response from AECom in time, whether we could do that next week, or we might have to flip to talking about Churchill next week, depending on when we can get that information. Anybody have strong feelings? Does someone want to go first?
I won't be here next week, so.
Oh,
Sorry,
that's
but I
gonna,
can send you an email beforehand.
okay. I'm willing to wade into my, the feedback I've gotten from the community and the part that I'm really struggling with. So obviously, as we've heard from Keith, most of the folks who live in that neighborhood, nobody wants anything elevated. So really, when we're talking about the 2 elevated alternatives, I have concerns about both, very significant concerns. It comes down to sort of an aesthetic thing. Some folks are more concerned with the viaduct, and they feel like that it's higher, it's 5 feet higher, and so that the open space underneath it seems like it makes it sexier, for lack of a better term. But I think personally that the word hybrid is a misnomer for the hybrid, because really in the olden days when we talked about high-speed rail, that's actually considered a berm, and I think an earthen berm better describes what we're looking at, because a hybrid makes it seem like we're splitting, like the road goes down 10 feet and we go up 10 feet, and really we don't. The road only dips 5 feet, and the berm goes up 15 feet. So from a height perspective, it's only a 5-foot difference, and I know that 5 feet is not little when we're talking about, I mean, if you think about a 5-foot fence, it's still a pretty high fence. But once it's up, I don't know that I could personally tell the difference between 5 feet higher and lower. I know I had to judge the size of a lamp in my house that sits in the 2nd story, and I did terrible at it. So for me personally, that is I remember, Phil, at some point you pointed out that you would love to hear from the community. Do they think a hybrid is uglier than a viaduct or vice versa because of the visual
Yeah, I think I
impacts?
might have said that too. I mean, at some point, neither is going to be lovely.
Right.
I've heard the thing that I was struggling with is I've heard at different times.
Microphone. Oh, sorry.
The thing that I'm struggling with is I've heard very different contradictory views.
Mm-hmm.
And do I listen to the most recent views, or do I try to sort of take the average over time? And then do I weight them, so to
Right.
speak?
And so, thinking about what information we'd like from AECom, Chantal, I think you and I discussed after the town hall meeting, Greg and I actually had a chance to talk to the.
Wanted to bring that up, thank you.
Yeah, to the sound person, and.
The person operating the microphones.
Right, yes,
the
exactly.
AECom expert on rail noise.
Thank you, on rail
Yeah.
noise and vibration. And so we had a conversation about what helps to mitigate noise and vibration. So one of the observations that he made was in one of, I can't remember if it was the videos or the diagrams, but there's some inconsistency between in the viaduct or the hybrid, I'm not sure which, there's a sound wall, a short sound wall by the wheel well.
I'll actually tell you what he said,
Yeah.
he said, the picture we have of the hybrid option has no sound wall.
Okay.
And the berm So a 15-foot elevated berm would actually increase the amount of wheel noise that people near the tracks get. So that in his opinion, the hybrid option is not, the berm is not a viable option without a sound wall to send the noise of the train wheels up. So there you go, Megan's showing me one that does have a sound wall. There is a lot of talk about how a viaduct is noisier than a berm. This particular person did not confirm that. There is nothing for the people who live near the tracks. A viaduct is, I've not heard anyone who's an expert on rail noise tell me that a viaduct is noisier, a modern concrete viaduct is noisier to the people near the tracks than a berm.
Right, and so just to be sure, we're not relying on what Greg or I remember was said by said person. What I wanted to ask Chantal was
Yes.
can we get from AECom, or when can we expect, because I know we've asked for it already, the update about what we can know about noise and vibration and the kind of menu of mitigation options, I think is what we
I
have
think that's an
requested.
excellent idea.
And let me mention, those mitigation options are not just the sound wall, but it's also the way you tie the
And the
tracks
material
down.
as well.
there's all sorts of
Materials, the bedding, the way, you don't just use wooden cross ties.
And I'll say for the record once more that every single one of these options eliminates the sound of the train horns,
Yes.
which is the loudest thing that we hear. And the electrification of Caltrain eliminates the sound of the diesel engine, except for the freight trains at night. That leaves only the sound of the train wheels. I think we need to say that every time, because every time I read something online, I hear someone saying, I don't like any of these options because they're noisier.
Yeah, so Chantal, you want
To add on to that too, it's also the sound of the gates going down. That would go away as well.
bells and whistles?
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's also something I picked up at one of the earlier meetings was people would think about the noisy L's in, say, Chicago, in the Loop area. Those are steel, and steel is a wonderful transmitter of noise.
Steel viaducts are much noisier. We are
Yeah.
not building a steel
And we're not
viaduct
building
no
the
matter what.
Chicago Loop.
That's why Bart is loud. Chantal, I want to give Chantal a chance to say what she's trying to say.
I was just going to say, we have requested the analysis from AECom, and specifically the questions, this was on your XCAP list of questions, which is essentially tell us about the sound status quo and tell us about the sound of each of the alternatives that are under consideration. So I reminded them of that last week, and so I'll follow up with them on estimated timeline. to get
Okay,
back.
great. And I think maybe this, even if,
Yeah, I can get some version of something, at least clarification on what you.
yeah, I think because we have to put it on our agenda for the next meeting, I think, it's safe to assume that these things will have to be agendized kind of generally, like we're just going to keep talking and we may flip between one and the other based on the information as it comes in. So I just want to make sure everyone is prepared for that as we move forward. But I think that information is going to be helpful, certainly for me. I think the other thing that was notable that we heard was that there is no type of vegetation that can mitigate sound. That vegetation can be used to mitigate, any visual impacts, but not sound. So putting bushes or trees will not make the train quieter.
Can I mention one other thing that's not clear in the fact sheet about the viaduct, is that the plan for the viaduct from AECom is that the viaduct puts the train tracks farther from the houses on the side of Alma Street that the train tracks are now,
Right.
than the tracks are currently today.
Yeah.
And it's only clear if you look very carefully at the pictures or go way back to the animation they gave us a long time ago.
Right.
And I think that will make a difference. And to me, that's a big, substantial difference between the Meadow Charleston Viaduct and the Churchill Viaduct.
Well, and so going back to things I would like answered both from AECom and from Caltrain, right now, when you look at the cost estimates, if I'm looking at the criteria sheet, one of the things that it says is that the viaduct can be constructed in 2 years, and the reason is that they say that you do not need shoe fly tracks because of their positioning it on the outer banks, if you will. And if that is not acceptable to Caltrain for operational reasons, and because they really do want to make everything straighter, then that would make the cost of the viaduct go up. It's already more than the hybrid, but it would really make it go up, and so would the amount of time. And so we need clarification from both AECom and Caltrain as to whether that would be an acceptable. And I appreciate that with Caltrain, that's difficult because you typically have to show them your designs and tell them, but.
They're not going to give that specific of an answer, but we can ask.
Right, yeah, well, only because it would, I think otherwise we may have to add an additional caveat to all of these things, which is like, if it's true that we don't need two flight tracks, then the price is this. If not, it may be more and it may take longer. And I think that that's a really important caveat when we look at these prices, because I know in my mind, I'm like, well, if we're only looking at money, the hybrid is cheaper, but it takes 4 years. But if I'm looking at the viaduct, it's almost twice as much, but it only takes 2 years. But if it turns out that it's going to cost even more and it's still going to take 4 years, that might impact what I think about it.
Or the inconvenience cost was added, some cost added.
Yeah. So while we're on the subject, is there any other technical stuff related to the elevated alternatives for South Palo Alto that ex-cappers think is important that we get from AECom, so we can make sure we try to get as many questions in that would help us make a decision? Adina, I see you.
Yeah, I have a question about actually one of the other alternatives in terms of having fair comparisons. What is the time frame of the evaluation of the new options that may have a full property acquisition? And like, when will that be known about what the impact to homes will be?
So we asked that question earlier. They're trying to get us an answer, and what we decided is we're going to keep going through the existing ones and then fold that in as soon as we can get it.
Okay, because in terms of the lesser of evils, that answer is going to be a, pretty heavy evil. And then the other question, I think it relates to people's concern about the relative appearance, where there are different people that have different relative opinions about berm and a viaduct. And do we have any illustrations of like the Caltrans standard brutalist viaduct is really ugly, but there also are international examples of much nicer looking viaducts. And do we have any such thing so people can look and see, can do a fair comparison with what could be done that goes beyond your bog standard freeway?
I'll point out that some of the diagrams we had earlier on, some of the drawings showed a prettier viaduct than many of us thought was actually feasible, given freight trains carrying gravel. So I think there's been a desire from us in the past for them to make it look as bad as they can.
Right. I think,
So
and
we
I
can
think
be
we have to
pleasantly
be careful
surprised.
that while we need to know what we need, technical stuff that we need to know to be able to make a recommendation, I, for example, would love to understand, well, what type of plants are we going to be able to put around these things to make it look better? And I recognize that we may not have an answer for a very long time. And so it's going to come down to, assume the worst and try to imagine the best. But
Right. Although, given the fact that these issues are, like, aesthetics is an important factor in people's preferences about this, then having information about the aesthetics and not doing the, it's like, CEQA imagine the worst possible thing, because, like there are design choices. So I think
So
that
could
might-
we ask for vegetation and it all goes to mitigations of visual, right?
Yeah, I think I would bifurcate this in two ways. One being where we are in the process is kind of some of the same conversation we've had about some of the bike and ped things as well, where at the point in design in which we will get throughout this entire planning process, you won't know the granular exact design of any of these specific things. So I think vegetation is kind of one of those things. Is it a bush? Is it a tree? Those are things you would figure out a little bit later in the process, especially as you can see what's underground and see how far, like if, for example, with the trench, that discussion with the tiebacks, knowing that there are shallow root plants that you have to put there, what does a shallow root plant mean? I don't know. We would see more along further down the line. But to your question of some possibilities, I can definitely follow up with AECom and see what they can have now. But everything at this point is very conceptual because we're still in the conceptual planning part of our process. So it's a nice reminder to loop everything back to, you're not even at 15% design right now. So as you get further down the design line, you'll have more of those specifics.
I want to follow up on what Chantel just said, because I'm a little dismayed by the number of questions that are now coming forth, some of which are clearly not going to be answered in any time frame that we're talking about. And this gets us back to, are we going to bog down in questions? We tell ourselves from time to time that this is inevitable, that we're at to pick a number, at the 5% level of design. and that we're asking questions that are really not answerable until the 70, 80, 90th percent of design, and that inevitably we're going to have imperfect knowledge when we make our decisions. But if we're going to weigh down our process by lots and lots of questions which are not time answerable, we're not going to meet our deadline, and we're going to suffer some of the repercussions because they're not answerable in any reasonable period of time. So I think we have to make a decision as to what do we really, really need to know at this level, and what would be nice to know but isn't going to be knowable until later in the process.
So, go ahead, Tony.
Sorry. I sort of have a slightly different version of this, and that is if you don't look at these kinds of details up front in the 5% design and see where they can stall you down the road, we'll be doing this thing over again. And I think at this point, the place kind of things, the feel of it is not certain. For instance, a slightly separate issue but related is how do we know from AECOM or Caltrain if we can use that ground surface for a bike path for landscaping under a viaduct?
Use your mic.
Yeah, so that's a big issue, right? Whether it's going to be ugly or is it going to be fenced or can you use it for other uses?
We can't give you an answer.
So I think that's why we had asked for just getting a menu of what the mitigations are, because I think to your point, Larry, we'll need to decide, like, okay, we're not going to know what plants we can put on a viaduct versus a hybrid, but we could know these are the potential mitigations that are possible, and to the extent possible, broadcast to the council, okay, we're recommending, for example, a viaduct, but these are known potential mitigations, and list for them. Like, we anticipate if you pick a viaduct, you're going to have to pay for the sound wall, and you're going to have to pay for extra plantings, partly because my understanding is the cost estimates at this level are extremely rough and don't include all the bells and whistles, frankly. And if we know, like, look, the only way that, a viaduct will be palatable is if you put all these bells and whistles. So council, when you get these cost estimates, make sure you ask really hard about how much extra it's going to be for the sound wall and the this and the that. Then at least we can, it may not factor into why we choose one over the other, but I think it will be incumbent on us to represent back from the community's perspective, like, if I've got to have a viaduct and that is my only crappy option, then I want to pay for that sound wall, and I want to know what the total cost is for the best one that we can get. And we may not get all those things, but at least they can anticipate that extra.
So, Nadia, I think you bring up a very important point, which is that even if we can't figure out all the design issues now, we want to preserve options. So to the point about the using the right-of-way under the viaduct, I don't think the viaduct would preclude use of parkland, conversion to parkland. We're not compelling fencing, but we ought to state very clearly that it's our strong desire, as what you might call the aesthetic mitigations, that we see parkland. And that, I think that's very good use of our reporting function.
I would agree with Phil, and it's a very different thing than asking all those questions and delaying until you get a non-answer, which is what we're going to get in some places. It's a very different process. By all means, list things that we would desire if we choose alternative X rather than Y, but let's not expect that we're going to get perfection in the answers.
Yeah, because the answer could be, in effect, the commitment that, yes, we will design this in, and nobody may be willing to make that commitment now.
Absolutely.
I'm aware that I don't know all the ways one can mitigate sound. And so the guy might come and say, well, we also have this, if we do a hybrid, we had some person talk about whether it's possible to cover the walls of the berm, the walls of a hybrid in a sound absorbing noise so that the traffic from Alma would bounce back less to the houses. I had never thought of that. And I don't know if that's a thing. And if it is, I want to know that it's on a list that we could say, hey, we picked this, but eventually think about this other thing. And it may not, again, factor into our decisions, but. Okay, in the interest of time, if there's anybody else who has anything else that occurs to them that they think is technically relevant, you can always ping me. But I think we should probably move on to item number 5, which is the member updates and working group updates. And Adina, I'll let you start it off if you want to give us your update on what you heard about the regional mega measure and what you were talking about earlier.
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the regional measure, its chances are not looking fantastic. So at the, there was a presentation at the last Samtrans and Caltrain board meetings by their Sacramento lobbyist. And what they said was that the votes are looking very, very, very iffy. The regional measure would require a supermajority vote because it's being put forward as an urgency bill. An urgency bill is something that needs to go into effect the year that it's passed. So if they want to put a measure on the ballot in November and they're passing a bill now, it needs to have a 2/3 vote. The last big tax authorization was for a affordable housing funding. And there was a bill, AB 1487, that authorized a suite of housing funding. That passed by 1 vote last year. It wasn't an urgency bill. And this one would need 2/3, and they were not close. Also the latest was that the business consortium that is advancing a 1-cent sales tax has realized that those votes were a challenge, and also they were getting headwinds at Metropolitan Transportation Commission and ABAG that really wanted the housing funding and prioritized the housing funding. And so the latest proposal was to combine a transportation and housing measure, still using the 1-cent sales tax. However, the last I heard, as of the day before yesterday, the leaders of the Regional Housing Bond Initiative were not on board with this and were continuing to pursue their housing bond. They were still talking to the people in the business community that wanted the 1-cent sales tax, but they were pursuing the bond as their primary strategy. So that is not looking fabulous for a 2020 date. So meanwhile, by the way, there's also a group of equity and environmental advocates that don't like the 1-cent sales tax because it is regressive. And so they're doing polling on business tax and some other options that would be less regressive. So there may be interesting news on that about how that appeals to voters. Given that background, Caltrain has been saying that if it looked like a regional measure was not going to go forward, they would work on a local measure. There was a bill, SB 797, that passed a couple of years ago that authorized Caltrain to put on a 1/8% sales tax to fund Caltrain. That was what they were giving updates on this afternoon at the board committee meeting. And they are looking at, they're looking at a few different options, because one option is all the new money raised goes toward paying for increased Caltrain service and for Caltrain improvements that allow Caltrain to carry more people. And there's another version where some of the member agencies, for example, VTA in particular, is saying if there's a Caltrain tax, we would like it to rebate us so we don't have to pay for Caltrain anymore. And what that would mean is that people would be, if people were voting for a tax, they would be voting for less good new stuff, and they would basically be voting to give VTA and Samtrans and San Francisco a rebate. So there's going to be more money, more information coming forward about what the options for a Caltrain tax will be, and that there's going to be information coming forward over the next several months about that option. The thing about the ability to fund Caltrain's plans is, I think as I mentioned last time, and definitely sent email that I don't know if it was circulated to the group, is that Caltrain is talking under its business plan. They have this long-term, how do you increase service by 2040? Now they have an idea about how to provide, be able to carry more people significantly sooner, such that in the 2027 to 2030 timeframe, they could provide much better and more frequent service. That includes 8 trains per direction per hour. So with basic electrification, they're going to go from 10 trains per hour to 12. And then they're talking about the next step potentially going from 12 to 16 by 2027 to 2030, which will make a like just basic electrification in a couple years is not going to make a humongous difference in terms of the amount of gate downtime, but the amount that they're looking to do like over a decade, like would be a significantly more difference, and is good food for thought in terms of the relative time importance of thinking about grade separations.
Adina, is there a succinct place where we could look at what are the capital improvements necessary to get from 12 to 16 and what the cost of those improvements would be? Because I don't know if, does that include level boarding? Does it include any grade steps?
Yeah. Caltrain has some slide decks that have been presented to the last couple of board meetings and local policymaker working groups, and I have a nice concise blog post that you can read that I probably sent it to the group, but I can send it again to the group.
Do the Caltrain ideas also include platform lengthening as a way of increasing capacity for each train they're running?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. What they've come up with has been, we'll answer your question, but we'll answer something from Nadia that I didn't answer before, which is that the price tag for the more frequent service was, if I'm remembering right, $1.2 billion, not including any additional grade separations. The full Caltrain business plan, does have full grade separation, but just that increase in frequency, that is $1.2 billion without grade separations. And then to your question about longer trains, so I had thought that the first thing that they would be likely to do would be longer trains, but their conclusion was that actually in order to get to longer trains, they're going to need more changes to their train storage yards, and that was one of the reasons why they put forward the idea of more frequent service before they go to longer trains.
Does a large part of that capital cost, is that just for rolling stock or other?
A lot of it is rolling stock.
Okay.
Like you run trains more frequently and you actually need more trains to fit into the same time, yeah.
So this is good news that you're going to that Caltrain will go to 8 trains an hour, but I don't think our grade SEPs will be done by 2027, and I think there's a massive amount of clogging of this city. So I think we need to find a plan from 2027 till the grade SEPs are done for how traffic moves through the city.
If I was just going to guess as a guessing person, my guess is that 2027 it would be kind of fast and it would be later, but it still makes the time to get expensive grade separations done. If it's 2030, if it's 2032, that's still kind of a risk.
And we do have a placeholder in our table of contents that we just added, which is, okay, if this takes a while, here are suggested things that we would look at. And among those things could be, traffic improvements, quad gates, what else could be done to deal with that in-between period. Okay, do we have any other updates from the group? I told you all about my Barron Park meeting. I've met with the board yesterday, and I'm going to be presenting at their annual meeting. I have 20 minutes to present and 10 minutes for questions, which, yeah, stop laughing. So my goal is a really high level is just to, if people walk out of that meeting understanding what a train separation is, a grade separation is, and that we're talking about them and that they should visit the website, I'm going to consider it a win. So I don't think I'm going to be explaining anything about viaducts and whatever, because I'm sure those nice people have other things to do on a Sunday. But I do hope to drive a lot of traffic to the website. So, and I'll be sending along a kind of a short presentation and then sending them lots of links, because thankfully Barron Park has a very well-developed neighborhood association, and they have an awesome newsletter, so they can, I've got years of articles for them if they want to keep writing about trains. I can fill their newsletter for them. So a big thank you to the folks who made that happen. Chantal, did you have an update under this item? No, you have something on the town hall? Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, yeah, Inya?
So South, the people
People on Mariposa. Residents near Mariposa met with Mike Pierce, and they try to, have advocate. Would you say advocating, or sharing the ideas and then getting feedbacks, and people got somewhat excited about that. So
great.
Yeah, and some people still think it's don't understand it, why traffic has to move through Churchill, and they want it closed. But I think people are aware of new options.
Great. I did want to ask ex-cuppers if there's any, our role has morphed from what used to be, our job was to go out and try to tell the neighborhoods as much as possible to what's happening, to this very intense weekly meetings and now extensive homework, which I really appreciate us all doing. But if we have any suggestions about things that we could be doing to reach further into the community, I would welcome them, and I would ask you to send them to me and to Chantal. You don't have to, if you want to talk about them, that's great. You could also send them offline, but I think it would be.
A little while ago, I tried to get short pieces inserted in the PTA newsletters, and I was basically told you need months lead time to do that. If there's any way to short circuit that process, that would be desirable, because things are moving fast right now, and we don't even have months till we're going to do recommendations to council, let alone the town hall meetings.
So, Chantal, do you want to? No. So my question to you, though, was going to be, since the city is interfacing with the district, is there a way that we might be able to ask Don Austin, who sent us the summary, about what we can do to at least keep them advised, keep the school community advised of upcoming public town hall meetings, and kind of driving people to the website as much as possible? Any help is helpful.
And to do on a rapid response rate, not months lead time.
Yes, at the last City School Liaison Committee meeting, which is one of City Council's committees where it has 2 City Council members and 2 board members from PAUSD, Todd Collins, who is on that committee, mentioned that it will be good to share the information to the PTAs, and he mentioned they will even be able to post something about the town hall at one of the high schools. So we'll coordinate and see what's possible. They seemed optimistic at that time, which is great, because I think that helps get us a little higher priority than we otherwise would have.
The flyer.
We don't have as much weight as you think we do. But that was something they specifically requested as we talked about it. And the flyer will be updated.
And there was, the announcement made it into at least one of the newsletters I get. And I don't know if it was the whole district or our school, but anyway.
Yeah.
So there is a way to at least, get information through that channel.
I was just trying like Joe Citizen, and I got the pushback.
My information is old, but from what I remember about the newsletters, it's like there is a certain amount of stuff that comes from the top up, and then each school gets to add to that. So to the extent that we can get above the fold, if you will, on the coming from the district side. Yeah, just anything. We'll take anything at this point. And again, anybody who's got contacts in the business community, whatever you can do to help us get those folks involved and would be super helpful.
And I was going to mention this in the next item, but since we're talking about engagement, even though a lot of the people that you guys have been in contact with are up to speed about the project, it is still really helpful if you can kind of re-blast some of the alerts about the meetings for these upcoming town halls or even XCAP meetings, just as a reminder for people, because they hear it differently when it comes from essentially a colleague or a neighbor versus the city. So some people at the last town hall said, I usually get an email from someone on the XCAP, but I didn't see it this time. And I was like, oh, who was it? So just a reminder to send those out, because it is really helpful. And this was actually our lowest attendance public meeting that we've had. I think some of it was people were out of town. Some of it was a recap. So those that are aware were like, whatever, I know all this information. But the idea is for us to reach beyond the people that we've had at every other meeting. So I think it was a very productive meeting, which we'll talk about in the next item. But the more you can help push the word out, the more we think that we'll be able to draw people there, especially new people, hopefully.
Great. I need to take public comment on this issue, and then we can move to the town hall so we can wrap up on time. So do we have any members of the public who wanted to talk? Roland, you get 2 minutes.
Yeah, so let me give you an update on this sales tax. So this is what I presented this afternoon at 3 o'clock. So it's on 1/8, generates San Francisco $26.5 million. San Mateo County, $25 million. Santa Clara County, $56.5 million. And again, hello. So initially I said, well, maybe we could have more board members, to look after our money. Obviously that wasn't going to fly. So I made, I forgot what suggestion was, but what I suggested is that we have separate pots for each county. And then when we pay for operations, OPEX, and capital expenditure, it comes out of our pots. We use the same formula that we use now. And then what's left over stays in the county, which means we will have $30 million left, and we can start doing some major damage. Now, on the other question that Mayor Bird is still here, about this business of having longer platforms, we've been suggesting this forever. We know where we need longer platforms. It's Derrida, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, Redwood Junction, for crying out loud. I mean, we got over a mile of passing tracks there. Why aren't we using them? Because there is no station there. And unfortunately, Caltrain don't want to do this because we're creating artificial demands by having baby bullets. So their new plan is there will be no more baby bullets, and trains, after we spend $2 billion, will actually take 15 minutes longer between Derrida and San Francisco than it did 5 years ago. Well, good luck with that business plan.
Thank you. Roland, do we have anybody else who wants to speak on this item?
I'm not sure this is relevant here, but in terms of being able for the public to actually get relevant information, there was a mention before of door hangers on properties that could possibly be seized. I assume this is with the new options. Is that, since you're putting it on people's doors, I would think this is public information. Where can I find which properties and how many properties you're now projecting would be needed? Is that anywhere on a website?
Yeah, it is. It's in the town hall presentation that will be on the website. I'm not sure. Is it? It's on the website, yes.
Okay, so I've looked, thank you.
And I just want to stress for anybody watching and hearing this for the first time, these are extremely preliminary conceptual drawings, and so they did their best to kind of make folks aware, but that does not mean that that is what is happening, because it is still in flux. But it was presented at the last town hall meeting, and it will be further updated at a future meeting that's going to be held later in March, where there's going to be, hopefully by then, we'll have more details and more solid maps. But it just does relate to to one of the new ideas, actually. So
I do understand Chantel's going to talk about the, I guess, the meeting, the town hall meeting. But when I just look at this piece of paper and I look at comments, and a lot of the comments, traffic will be a nightmare, blah, 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 all these really, really negative traffic stuff that's going to happen with the Churchill closure. I'm just wondering if you had the traffic engineer there and you had, like, this 8-page document that has all the traffic numbers, so you could have, like, mitigations, what that's supposed to do, because the LOS does not change that much. Remember, we had a whole, I don't know how many meetings about all the traffic, so I feel like, if you have these meetings and people come away with the same thing that they went in with, or they didn't, really get the traffic engineer perspective. I mean, I'm not a traffic engineer. Nobody here is a traffic engineer that I know of. And most people don't understand all that, all the LOS, what it all means, but they've spent hours and hours and hours. And I feel like if it's not reflected here in the comments and what they're going to the meeting to get, then what is the point of the meeting to just kind of get general ideas out there that, I don't know, aren't really well articulated so people can really understand what they actually do.
thank you. Because I've been doing this for a while, I just want to draw the punch card document that Chantal passed out. I just want to. This is basically people who attended the meeting and how they voted. So we have here a little chart that shows what neighborhood they're from, and that's really important because when you see some things might be weighted more than others, it's obviously also impacted by if you have a lot more neighbors from a particular neighborhood. So I just want to make sure that everyone is, when you're looking at that data, that you make sure to look at that not in a vacuum, but kind of weigh those things. Obviously, if you've got more folks from one neighborhood, you might skew some of the data. And it's not to say that it's not important feedback, but I do want to be sure that people are aware of that when they look at that, because it's a common problem when we get these summaries of town halls, and especially because the next two are going to be more subject location specific, that you may get more information at those or more different skewed things. So with that, we can move now to staff update and talk about the actual town hall. So Chantal, I'll let you.
Sure. So I will, a couple of things. talking future town halls first because I want everyone to have note that tomorrow's town hall has been postponed. It was specifically focused on Meadow Charleston, and we postponed it because we discovered there's an overlapping meeting for the North Ventura Coordinated Area Plan, which is also, I think, from 6 to 9 at Gunn High School, and it's a similar constituency. And so we knew that we could afford some more time to do additional analysis related to Meadow Charleston, so we volunteered to postpone our meeting so that MVCAP can still go forward with theirs. So the tentative date that we have right now is March 26th, and I am waiting for confirmation from Gunn High School, which is the location that we're looking at. So I'm leaving it as tentative until they literally put in our admin's hands the confirmation notice of that. I know the room is available, we just need that confirmation before I start widely publicizing. But as soon as I get that, I will distribute that information to you, and the flyer will be updated as well, which will say postponed for tomorrow and share the new date.
Do we
Any
have a
questions
hold
on
on that room so nobody else can get it?
I hope so. I don't control their scheduling system as much as I would like to for purposes like this. So my hope is we'll know this week or early next week. But please share broadly. I sent you guys the postponement notice. Feel free to forward that widely. In terms of the last town hall meeting last week, the punch card was discussed. So we made sort of a high-level opportunity for people to be able to tell us where they are moment in time. And it was good, neutral, bad, and comment. So the comments that are on the one distributed are just things that people wrote related to each of the alternatives by location. And so our plan is for the next town halls, which are more specific. One will be specifically about Churchill, and one will be specifically about Meadow Charleston, that we go into a little more detail of each of the alternatives. If you have not had a chance, the presentation from last week is online, and I have a couple copies here in black and white if you wanted one. The goal last week was very high level. These alternatives exist. Here's a picture of it. Please go talk to staff and get more information about it. We'll have a more detailed presentation at subsequent town halls because we didn't want the presentation to last 50 minutes, which is about how long it would have taken to go through animations for 7 alternatives last week. So that's why we kept it very high level. But we'll be able to get a little more granular at the upcoming town halls, particularly for Churchill because there are just 2 and then the information about the new idea. So are there other staff updates that I'm not remembering? There's going to be something when we walk away. Any questions on any of that for now?
So I very much appreciated hearing that Ed made the call to door tag some folks. I'm wondering if we could do that even for potential partial or slivers or temporary takes, just because I still think it's important to get those people activated. And now that the next 2 meetings are going to be geographically focused, you have a better chance of getting those actual folks in the meeting in their neighborhood at that time. And so I don't know how much anticipated time you put a door hanger on, but that would be
Yeah, we can see what we can do. I think, if we want to do that, we would do it probably as a mailer. And, yeah, we can check with planning to see how to do that most efficiently. I actually had to go out and do the door hangers myself after work, so I don't think that's really a feasible model when we're talking about, I think that's like over 100 houses that we'd be doing. Actually, probably 200, which is why actually we really limited it to the full property takes.
I just, as Chantal said, this turnout was not as good as previous meetings, and there could be a lot of reasons, but can we ask the new communications director, I forget her name, Megan, to really put some juice into publicizing the next town halls?
Yeah.
And tell people it's really important that they attend?
Yeah, what's funny about that is we actually advertise more for these meetings than we have in the past. We actually did some paid ads, had radio, had newspaper, utility bill inserts. So that's why I'm thinking there's some other factor besides just publicizing, because this one was actually spread more broadly than we've ever done before,
Well,
which is strange.
Yeah, and
But yes, we will continue to do that.
What happened? So maybe, I'll just say this, a survey is in order to understand what's not working, because that we will have meetings beyond this next round of town halls. I'm sure there'll be meetings on this next year and possibly even the year as the council makes decisions and things roll forward.
And on this issue of informing people whose slivers might be taken, I would not go there. I think it's not set in stone. It's so amorphous right now. It's not even set in jello. And so I wouldn't push people to get. They're going to get afraid and worried and so on. So be careful.
So I hadn't seen, in fact, I didn't even get a chance to read what the door hanger said. Yeah, and so it says there's discussions that may impact your property. As long as it's loose enough, I think as long as we keep caveating at these meetings, but quite honestly, if we don't start to activate the folks that are nearest the places that are going to be impacted in some way or another without freaking them out, they are going to show up at the very last second. And so we have to, yeah, and so it's a very delicate dance, and that's why I want to be sure that we say at every meeting, these are just conceptual, we're still working on things, it's going to take a lot of work. But also, yes, this is still happening, yes, we're still talking about this, yes, decisions are coming, and so please get involved. I mean, my biggest concern is that it's not just that it was just the end of ski week when this other town hall meeting was held, and maybe that's why we didn't have as much turnout, but more than anything is the fatigue issue. I mean, I know I've been doing this for 11 years, and I know we reached a fatigue point with high-speed rail, certainly. I think in some ways we reached it faster with this because the process in the very beginning was quite erratic, frankly. We didn't really go through a very stable process, and it was, sometimes things happened at rail committee, then we stopped having rail committee, and things happened at city council. Like, even for those following along, they couldn't follow where the ball was going. Since XCAP has been formed and we've had really regular meetings, for those who are paying attention now, it's obvious where everything is taking place. But that isn't the case before. And frankly, we lost a lot of people even when we just had the cap, when we were having meetings, but we weren't really, from their perspective, it didn't seem like things were going anywhere, right? And so.
Well, let's see what's in the paper. What I was going to say was, speaking of fatigue.
Oh.
It's after 7 o'clock.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Okay, I have to take public comment on this last item. Is there anybody who has public comments on the staff update on town hall meetings?
I don't think you have to take public comment on it.
On every item?
No,
Isn't that what's
that's
required?
It's an information.
Okay, so it's informational. All right, time's up. Thank you, everybody. Meeting adjourned.